Good morning. Good morning. So I want to welcome you again to the EEH 100th celebration. We're very pleased to welcome you here. We're thrilled that so many from the past and the present of the department have been able to join us here to mark this important event and to celebrate all that's been accomplished and to think about where we're going next. This is a celebration of a remarkable legacy of education and research, and some of that is going to be highlighted in the symposium today. We had a great talk yesterday by Dr. Vina for the Saxon Graham lecture. We're very excited to have Dr. Szklo here to give a plenary talk, and we're also excited about hearing from the other symposium speakers, all of whom are alumni and current or former faculty. As we prepared for the 100th celebration, it became increasingly clear to me that for a relatively small department, we've had a disproportionate impact. EEH is among the oldest department schools of public health in the country, and we've had this history of contributions to the leadership in epidemiology and public health. There's a binder of published research that represents some of the highlights of the contributions, and I would encourage you to browse that. That's by the registration desk. And as one proxy of impact, I wanted, by my admittedly informal count of the legacy of leadership by alumni, former and current faculty, we account for 3 presidents of SER, 2 presidents of the American College of Epidemiology, at least 1 president of SPER, 2 of the AACR molecular epidemiology leaders, and I'm sure there are other major organizations that I haven't included. So John talked about former deans that came out of this school, or out of the department. At least 4 deans or former deans of schools of public health or related to schools. There are several VPs for population health and cancer centers. A large number of department chairs for epidemiology and related fields got their degrees in our department. A number of leaders in government agencies, including intramural and extramural research, and the recent graduates too are taking on all kinds of challenges and are really the leaders of the future. So they've done an impressive array of different kinds of positions. So, and these are just some of the highlights. I'm sure that there are others that I've inadvertently omitted, and we have a great deal to be proud of. And then one further acknowledgement of leadership that I want to make. As we look at those photos, as the pictures that were being shown of the leaders in the past, in the early part of the department, it's obvious that they show almost no diversity. And there's been important leadership, including from some of the women and people in this room, to change that. There are women who've moved through not being taken seriously, being paid less, being discounted or worse, and others who've made it a priority to make our department and our science and our fields inclusive on every dimension, to end the formal and informal ways that people have been excluded. So I want to acknowledge that kind of leadership as well. Thank you. So today's talk will highlight more of the history and provide a discussion of where we're going as a field. We also have some short presentations about things that are currently happening in the department as a chance to showcase where we are currently. So an event like this takes an incredible amount of work. I want to thank the members of the steering committee for the 100th celebration. They provided guidance, great ideas, and assistance with implementation. We'd never done anything like this before, and it was terrific to have their input. In particular, I want to thank Amy Millen, who did an enormous amount in putting together this event. I want to give a special thank you to Dean Jean Wachtowski-Wendy, the dean of our school, an alumni of our PhD and a faculty member in the department. She's been so very supportive of this project with ideas, connections to former students and faculty, and in particular, she and Carl have graciously agreed hosting a reception this evening. We're very appreciative. I hope to see you all at that event as well. I want to thank the EEH administrative staff who have been putting in an incredible effort to make sure that thousands of details get attended to. I want to also thank the administrators of the school for their help and guidance, for providing us with lists of alumni, helping with contacting everyone, and with the planning for the event. I want to thank SAS for their sponsorship, and I want to thank all of you for coming, for all of your contributions to EEH during some part of the last 100 years to make this the institution that we're so proud of. In addition, I want to thank you, everyone who contributed to the 100th Fund. Some of those funds provided support for students to attend this event. In addition, the funds will be invested to support students with stipend, tuition support, travel to meetings, and other expenses of that kind. In these days of tightening financial resources, as you all know, these contributions are critically important. As many of you may remember, relatively small amounts of money can have a really large impact on students as they strive to move forward in their careers, so thank you. There are a number of students here today. They have markers on their tags. They all are listed as students. Many of them have posters in the hall outside this room. I've encouraged the students to use this symposium as an opportunity to network. We have some outstanding students, and I hope that you'll enjoy the chance to engage with them. Also, I want to say we have arranged for a tour of Buffalo tomorrow. There's really some very interesting things going on. The tour will include the new downtown medical center, Canal Side. So if you are interested in that, please sign up. At this point, nobody's signed up, so so it's completely available. So I'm looking forward to today's events and to continuing this journey into the future. Here's to the next 100 years. So the first speaker today is our plenary lecturer, Dr. Moyses Szklo, and Dr. Enrique Schisterman will provide an introduction. Thank you.
Again, thankful for the opportunity to introduce a great friend and somebody who has been a leader of the field for many, many years. Dr. Szklo is the current editor-in-chief of the journal, the oldest journal in our profession, the American Journal of Epidemiology. He has been the editor-in-chief for 31 years. Counting how many papers AJE gets around 1,600 papers a year, which implies that he has made decisions on around 50,000 papers. That's a lot of reading. Moyses is also an amazing cardiovascular epidemiologist. He has made many, many contributions, including the first discoveries of how social and biological factors affect cardiovascular disease, and have tremendous contributions on that. And he's currently also a professor of epidemiology at also another very old school, the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health, who celebrated the 100th anniversary with our school, which is funny thinking about these two great schools launching their trajectory together. So I'm very proud to be part of this school, but also proud to introduce my great friend, Moyses Szklo.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good morning, everybody. So thank you, Enrique, for that introduction. I'm really honored to be here. I see some people that I've known for a long time. And actually, first thing I want to do is to thank Joe Freudenheim and Gina. I have to stop to mention to say your last name, like mine, Bartkowski Wendy. I think I did okay, right? So for the invitation, to me it's an honor to be here celebrating such an important event. So I was asked to talk about the past and the future of epidemiology. The problem is I'm not a historian. So what I've done instead what I'm going to do instead is to give you some snippets through the eyes, historical snippets through the eyes of the American Journal of Epidemiology, because the evolution of epidemiology and the types of papers that have been published in the AJE, they're completely synchronous. So, I'm not a historian, and I see the AJE gave us a somewhat simplistic idea of the evolution of discipline since 1921. And interestingly, next year, the AJE is going to be 100 years old. And also, I wanted to let you know that after, it feels like a 2-century tenure, Enrique Schisterman is going to be the new editor-in-chief from July 1st. I'm delighted that he accepted to take the position. I'm sure he's going to do very well. So the AJE was founded in 1920 by Welch as the American Journal of Hygiene. And the first editorial was very interesting because it said, it is hoped that the American Journal of Hygiene may serve by opening its pages for scientific contribution from such different sciences. And then he mentioned several sciences, and epidemiology is just one of them. And indeed, the first issue from January 1921, there was only one paper that we could identify with epidemiology. Now, I skipped several years, but nothing much happened. So what you see here is very typical of this period between 1921 and 1964. 45% of the papers were in the infectious disease area, 45% lab, and chronic disease, there were no papers on chronic disease epidemiology as late as 1964, which is really interesting. So, given that, Neil Nathanson, who was the editor-in-chief at that time, he decided to change the name of the journal to American Journal of Epidemiology. And he says the change in title means that the Board of Editors will welcome an increased number of papers which are significant contributions to the epidemiological method and the epidemiology of non-infectious disease. But the latency was very long because 5 years after the change of name, still 42% of papers were the infectious disease papers, and only 2 papers, 17%, were in the chronic disease area. Now, jumping to 1980, situation has changed, as you see. Now, in 1980, almost 40 years ago, chronic disease epidemiology predominates. Although still we are publishing quite a few papers in infectious disease. And if you look at the more recent period, you can see that chronic non-transmissible diseases predominates. More than half of the papers are in that area, although we keep publishing, rightly so, of course, a lot of papers on infectious disease epidemiology. And this is the most recent data that I have. You can see 45% of papers are in the chronic non-infectious disease area. So you have some interesting issues outside celebrating the 150th anniversary of the State University of New York, Buffalo School of Medicine, Biomedical Science, but focusing on the epidemiology legacy. And I strongly urge you to read at least the editorial by John Vina, who's sitting right there. It's a very informative editorial pertaining to the history of the epidemiology department, epidemiology and environmental health department. So, but when the name was changed, Neil Nathanson also wanted to call attention to the fact that he wanted more papers on the epidemiological method. And indeed, we published in the 1970s probably a landmark paper. It really changed the paradigm of epidemiological methods, in which Olli Miettinen showed that if you use a sample of a defined cohort as your control group and calculate the odds ratio of exposure, what you get is the relative risk. That was an incredible change. Incidentally, there's nothing wrong with the odds ratio. The only problem is that people tend to interpret it as a relative risk, and it is not a relative risk. So currently about 1/3 of the AJA papers are on methods. So between the AJA methods papers in the chronic disease, it's almost 80% of the papers we publish. All right, let me go to something else. In 1970, it also saw the beginning of modern discussion of causal inference. So this is a snippet. We published that important paper by Ken Broadman on causes, in which he discusses his causation model. And then this paper by Murphy and Sussan, everybody should be reading those two papers. Okay, so those are just snippets. I mainly want to talk about the future. And what I'm going to show you is my hopes. Some of them seem to be more feasible, others tend to be less feasible. And what I'm going to do, for some of those hopes, I will stop and elaborate a little bit, but not for all of them, okay, because I have a lot to be covered. So some hopes for the future. Use of big data with quality assurance and quality control. This is terribly important because big data is becoming more and more popular. And I think the main obstacle, the main limitation is the fact that those data usually have not been collected for research purposes. And therefore, issues of quality assurance and quality control are absolutely paramount. Now, studies based on life course cohort to better identify early determinants and mediating factors and increase recognition of the role of social determinants. So this is important. You know, it has to do also with social epidemiology. And something really interesting happened with social epidemiology. You know, in the 1970s, some of us may recall, excuse me, I have to keep drinking water because I tend to get dehydrated. Some of us may recall the flurry of papers on social epidemiology in the 1970s. You know, people like Tyrola, Al Tyrola, people like Castle, Lansine, they were very active in this area. And somehow, I don't understand why, in the late 80s, mid 80s, 90s, it sort of disappeared. Very social epidemiology. But there has been a renewed focus, thanks to people like Kawashi, Shiro Kawachi, Anna Diaz-Rue, and Jay Kaufman, Sherman James. So I think it's a very good development. And I'm happy to say that the AJE is probably the journal that publishes more social epidemiology papers than any other journal. So this is interesting. Now, the other hope is development of biomarkers to measure present and past exposures. We have quite a few biological biomarkers that measure current exposure or very recent exposure. But we need to develop ways to measure past exposures in a more accurate way. Better understanding of the potential metabolomics and proteinomics. This is something else that I think is important. Now, growing understanding of new analytical methods. We're getting more and more papers, not just our journal, all the epi journals, dealing with machine learning. And I might confess my ignorance about machine learning. It looks like an exploratory kind of strategy rather than a study of associations based on specific hypotheses. But you know, I can't be critical because it's becoming more and more common and I don't fully understand its potential. And also, I think we need to understand the potential limitations of observational strategy that mimic randomized trials. And you know, the classical example is Mendelian randomization and then instrumental variable strategy in general. Now, this is something that is one of my pet hopes. Increase in the epidemiological students' exposure to human biology and primary data collection. I think in many ways for financial kinds of support type problems, most of the students at Hopkins, and I'm sure he is the same thing in all schools of public health, they end up doing thesis studies, doctoral theses, based on secondary data, available databases. So they are missing terribly important components of what epidemiology should know. You know, how to design a questionnaire, which is really one of the main challenges. To design a good questionnaire is really complex. You know, when I design a questionnaire, first thing I do is to pre-test it. So I applied it to my wife. And, you know, it's a masterpiece, right? Dr. Szklo is 100 years old. He's been an epidemiologist since the 19th century. So when I do that, oh, she gets upset. She doesn't understand half of the questions. The skip patterns don't make any sense, and she gets very annoyed. So we get to like 1/3 of the questionnaire, and I say, stop, enough. So it's very hard to design a very good questionnaire. And then I think a lot of epidemiology is based on human biology. And I think, you know, again, because of funding problems, in the School of Public Health many, many years ago at the Hopkins, the Doctor of Science students had to take basic courses in medical school. But that's not feasible. It's too expensive and too time consuming. But I think it's a hope, okay? They're all hopes. Growing reliance on randomized trials to evaluate prevention and cessation. Clarification of the current confusion between the epidemiological and statistical methods. They're both terribly important. Biostatistics is crucial to epidemiology, but it's not epidemiology. There's a little bit of an overlap. And I just want to remind you of what epidemiology is all about. Some objectives. Well, this is the classical definition. Study the distribution of disease and so on. Generate hypotheses based on the triad that explain distribution, etc. So this is the classical definition. And then develop questions that are biologically or sociologically or psychologically, etc., plausible, and design a study to answer that question. So that's very important. And then develop or choose data collection procedures with quality assurance and quality control. And I wonder how many of the Hopkins students go through this process. And then assist public health administrators and policymakers in establishing health programs and policy. So this is important. I mean, you can see that, of course, biostatistics is important. Both analytical and descriptive biostatistics are important, but it's not epidemiology. And I'm afraid that at least at Hopkins, we're training the students to be to be methodologists. You have to know and you have to understand methodology, but you have to also realize that those things, the objectives of epidemiology, the functions of epidemiology, are not entirely overlapping with the functions of biostatistics. Okay, this is another thing, you know, more flexibility from funding agency, given the transdisciplinary nature of epidemiology. And I want to show you a couple of examples, very old historical examples. First one is just to show you there are lots of papers now, more and more papers. They are in the intersection between epidemiology, molecular biology, parasitology, immunology, and so on and so forth. So epidemiology is part of a group of areas, of disciplines. And this is what makes, in many ways, modern epidemiology so exciting. Now, the first example is Milton Terry's introduction to Goldberg on pellagra. And I just wanted to lift this sentence. And these papers are arranged in 5 general sections entitled Preliminary Observation and Hypothesis, Human Experiments, Community Studies, the pellagra preventive factor, in summation, the nature and prevention of pellagra. So Goldberg, he was an epidemiologist, but he was also someone who did experiments, the community studies, and so on and so forth. Now, the other example you all know is John Snow's strategies. John Snow, you know, he did the epidemic curve, although as you can see, by the time the pump was closed, was removed, the epidemic was on the wane. And some funny gal then defined epidemiology as an epidemiologist, as someone who goes down on the epidemic curve towards glory, something like that. He also did spatial studies, right? You could say geographical studies with the distribution of cases around the Broad Street pump. He did self-experiments. he showed that if he had examined a cholera patient but washed his hand himself, he wouldn't get cholera. He did ecological studies, sources of water that people use in their households. And he did association studies. You all know this table is very famous. So you can see there was a lot of flexibility. And I think we need some of that in epidemiology. Maybe not everybody should be doing that. But I think this kind of, like MacArthur Fellowship, that you can do a lot of different things, not just what is specified in your grant proposal or contract. So this is important. Okay, this is also one of my favorite hopes. Increased recognition of the importance of consequential translational epidemiology and implementation science, and that the semantics and choice of model of applied translation epidemiology are not entirely consistent with those of etiological epidemiology. So, let me show you. It's a radical view. I don't know how many of you knew George Comstock. George Comstock was an epidemiologist, a professor of epidemiology at Johns Hopkins. And he did some of the landmark studies on tuberculosis, BCG. And I think he did the first study on population distribution of blood pressure. It is really amazing. If you go back to that paper and you ask the question, how much have we learned beyond what George Comstock found out? Very little, really. And I think one of the funny things about George was I was a student, and George was one of my mentors. And one day he asked me, what is the best way to analyze data? So I mumbled a few things, regression, whatever, nasal code, some of the things that I was studying at that time. He said, no. The best, I never forgot that, the best way to analyze data is to look at the data and think about what you're seeing. So, and I have an example in a few minutes in which, I'll show you how that kind of view translates. Now, Saxon Graham was someone that I knew fairly well. He was a wonderful, wonderful man. He was a good friend of mine, as a matter of fact. And he came to Hopkins. He went to Hopkins a couple of times to make presentations. He was a great lecturer, great presenter. And he worked as both an investigator as a public health activist. For example, in the early 1960s, and this comes from Jim Marshall's and Dr. Freudenheim's obituary published of Sachs, published in the American Journal of Epidemiology. He said in the early 60s, as evidence of the pathogenicity of smoke accumulated, and well before governmental entities had acted, he and a prominent oncological surgeon went to the New York State Capitol to urge legislators to require that warning labels be affixed to cigarette packages. So the understanding that you do studies to help public health and prevention. I think this is a very important concept that I think is being lost in many ways in many schools of public health. It may be one of the reasons that so many of the old generation before mine, epidemiologists, they have come from health departments. So they saw epidemiology as a tool of public health. And I have a very interesting example, Morton Levin. Incidentally, I actually knew a lot of, because I'm 120 years old, I knew a lot of the people mentioned in John's editorial that were associated with Buffalo. And Morton Levin is one of them. He did that smoking lung cancer study, famous study at Roswell Park Memorial Institute. I knew Milton Terry's. Abe Lilienfeld was the chairman of epidemiology at Hopkins when I was a student, and so on. So, it's a particular pleasure to be here, to know that those great people, they all suffering quotes, they were exposed, that's a better way to say it. Not a risk factor, but exposed to the culture of the School of Public Health at the University of Buffalo. So Morton Levin is another example of this type of people who thought that epidemiology is a tool of public health. So as you know, he published the first paper on the association between smoking and lung cancer. That's an incredible contribution. And then, of course, the unadjusted population attributable risk. And then he got a prize from the American Public Health Association. He got an award, the Frost Award, for his contributions to epidemiology. Well, when I talked to him about it, this is what he said. When I got the Frost Award from APHA for my contributions to epidemiology, I was surprised, because I always saw myself as a public health officer. And he actually told me that he thought that the lung cancer smoking research was not his favorite research. He mentioned that he was particularly proud of having facilitated the polio trials in New York and having insisted that they use random allocation in the trial. That's what he said. This is what I really did. Because smoking and lung cancer, one way or another, with Dollar and Hill and Wind and Graham and so on and so forth. So another example of an epidemiologist with a great insight and talent in practice of public health. So this is a famous paper by Galea. I'm sure everybody here knows it, in which he makes a strong plea for a renewed focus of epidemiology as a tool of public health. And this is what he says in a paper published in the American Journal of Epidemiology. A more consequential approach has several implications. And then he goes on, he clarifies research priorities, offers a perspective on the place of novel epidemiological approaches, etc. And also brings into sharp focus our engagement in implementation and translation of science. So this one is one of my pet projects. I participated in the creation of a committee in the epidemiology department at Hopkins, a committee to study translation epidemiology, to offer recommendations for research and teaching. And I had a sort of a preliminary definition that is effective transfer of new knowledge resulting from epidemiological studies, including trials into the planning of population-wide and individual-level disease control programs and policies. And it's really interesting because when you think about translational epidemiology, consequential epidemiology, then I realized that some of the language we use in ideological epidemiology is not entirely applicable to translation epidemiology. I want to give you a couple of examples. Okay, one is a semantic, confounding as a bias, and there are two topics under the methodological differences. The model that you choose to analyze your data, and the issue of efficacy versus effectiveness. And when I did the slides, also with the epidemiology students in mind, really. So, let's start confounding as a bias, okay. Nobody laughs. This seems to be a bad joke. I have to remove this slide. So, common reaction amongst epidemiologists and students of epidemiology. Confounding is horrible, right? It must be prevented, exterminated, destroyed, eradicated, executed, right? So that's confounding is bad. It's a bad thing, right? So, in some epidemiology and biostatistics textbook, they actually talk about bias due to confounding, bias not due to confounding. So, this is a semantic conundrum. Is confounding always a bias? Well, if you go back decades in the old textbooks of epidemiology, they divided associations into causal, confounded, they called it indirect, and bias, artifactual. And in A. Blidenfeld's book, those two, he says they are true. He states they are true associations. So he said both the causal and the confounding association, they are true. They're not a bias. Now, what is the implication? Okay, in observational studies, residual confounding is an important threat to causal inference, which is sine qua non for primary prevention, right? Observational epidemiological studies are in good company. There are lots of disciplines that are observational, and a lot of the policies were influenced, public health policy, public policies were influenced by observation epidemiological findings, indoor smoking ban, its radiation exposure standards, etc., etc. But the question is that because of possible residual confounding, care is required when making causal inference based on statistical association. I agree with that. But the question is a confounding association useful for public health? And I think the best example, there are several examples, is the relationship between African American ethnicity and hypertension, which is severely confounded by poverty, right? Excessive salt consumption, obesity, job strain, neighborhood stress, and so on and so forth. So it's a confounding association. Is it helpful? Yes, in two ways. Screening of this high-risk group for identification and control of established hypertension, and focus on this high group to promote prevention and cessation of modifier of risk value. So the question is, what is it, the other way of understanding the difference between bias and confounding is what I would call the natural history of a study. So what is the natural history? You start with a hypothesis, right? Then you have a study base, a reference population, right? Then you have your sample to do the study. Collect data, get the results, interpret the results, and publish your results, right? Your paper. And in each one of those steps, there might be bias. You could have plausibility bias when you generate a hypothesis. Selection bias when you study your sample from that study base. When you choose that sample from the study. Information bias, analytical bias, inferential bias, and publication bias. Where is confounding? Confounding is in the population. It's only a bias for causal inferences purposes. So it's not a bias if you want to identify high-risk groups. And this is very important in my opinion. So is it a bias? It depends. Classical answer to any epidemiological study. Yes, if the purpose is to infer a causal association. No, if the purpose is to identify high-risk markers in the population. Okay, so this is a semantic difference. I don't think confounding is a bias. Confounding exists in the population. It's real. I don't know how much time I have. I lost track. 10 minutes, maybe? Oh. Okay. So, yes, if you want to infer a causal relationship. No, if you want to identify high-risk markers in the population. And Donna Spiegelman mentioned this as public health confounding. It's the name, the title of this type of confounding. Okay. Okay, now, this is another thing that is big difference between 99% of the papers that arrive in the, submitted to the AJE, people calculate ratio-based measures of association. Okay, hazard ratio, odds ratio, rate ratio, odds ratio, etc. So in epidemiology, they are addicted to ratio-based measures of association, right? So let me show you how that translates into the difference between etiological and public health epidemiology, translation epidemiology. So this is a simple table showing the relationship between asbestos exposure and looking at the possible effect modification by smoking. And you can see something that is totally inconsistent. It looks like asbestos is more strongly related to lung cancer death rates in people who never smoked. Doesn't make any sense, does it? So this is counterintuitive, right? Now, if you look at, this is what we call negative multiplicative interaction. But the possible wrong inference that I've seen in 2 or 3 papers submitted to us, if we could, not on this topic, different topics, if resources are limited, prevention of asbestos exposure should target never smoking. Doesn't make sense. Now let's look at the absolute difference. Now you see an incredible difference in the absolute excess, which is only that epidemiologists with an interest in public health should focus on. Absolute excess. Now we have strong positive additive interaction that Ken Rothman has called public health interaction. Okay, so this is important. This is another example in the clinical epidemiology area, the relationship between diabetes in previous MI in relation with in regard to a subsequent MI. So in people who already have an MI, had an MI, is the second MI. Those who didn't is the first MI. And you can see again, the same phenomenon. Negative multiplicative interaction, positive additive interaction. So if you are a public health person, forget about ratios. You have to think about absolute differences. And I may be exaggerating a little bit to make my point, okay? And why is that? That happens particularly when the reference categories is very high. So you can see here that for people with diabetes and without a previous MI, the incidence is very high. So the ratio tends to go down when the incidence in the reference category is high. Okay, now to finish, let me talk about efficacy versus effectiveness, something our students, actually those themes are things that I feel, even my hopes for the future, they're based on my experience at Hopkins and at the American Journal of Epidemiology. So this is another thing that our students don't get terribly well. Incidentally, at Hopkins, they don't get a lot on quality assurance and quality control either. So this is such a key area in epidemiology, and yet our students just don't learn about it. If you ask a student, what is the difference between quality assurance and quality, they don't know. So that's interesting, but if you ask them, go to the blackboard or whiteboard or yellow board, whatever that is now, and tell me about regression, this type of log linear regression. Well, they go and half of what they put on the blackboard I cannot understand, and so on. But if you ask simple questions, then it's different. Actually, I think even some of the basic epidemiological concepts, things like incubation, latency period, modes of transmission and so on, they don't know too well. It's amazing. How can you do a PhD in epidemiology and not know? It's like being a physician, you don't know what a common cold is. So efficacy versus effect. So there's a process to translation epidemiology. So I want to focus. I want to tell you where is the efficacy effectiveness in this process. Okay, so the knowledge translation process. You start with evidence, right? And then you evaluate levels of evidence. Like the Canadian Task Force or the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force, they have a list of types of studies and how strong their results are in terms of efficacy or effectiveness. And then evaluation of effectiveness of programmatic issues, decision analysis, with or without a sensitivity analysis. Then you have to have a health economist, an ethicist, and so on, and do a cost effectiveness analysis that also has a sensitivity analysis. And then evidence-based recommendation. And there's always a tension between obstacles, ethical resources, political obstacles, and evidence. So this is where the effectiveness differs from efficacy. And you do decision analysis, and you do a decision tree, such a simple thing. And our students don't know how to do that. It's amazing, Like if you have a decision tree, you can see the difference. For people in this case, in this example, who tolerate the intervention, you can see that the mortality is much less for B than for A. But of course, you have to take into account also people who don't tolerate the intervention. So if you do look at the total, which includes the mortality of people who don't tolerate the intervention, and then look at the joint probability of those routes, then you can see clearly that A has the low mortality. Okay, so it's really interesting. B has the highest efficacy but effectiveness is better for A. So this is a simple thing, right? Everybody should know. And if you ask our students at Hopkins, I hate to be so critical of Hopkins, and I suspect that that's not just a Hopkins phenomenon. That's a generalized phenomenon. Basic things are not being taught, in complex models that are also important in many ways are being taught. Okay, so here you are. Total mortality for A is lower, even though for those who tolerate, the intervention is higher. At that point, you could do a sensitivity analysis, which is a simple thing. I have a confusing definition. I have to change that. So you examine the changes in the output of a given model resulting from varying certain model parameters over a reasonable range. So you could ask the question, what would be the effectiveness if the level of intervention B, if its tolerance increased from 10% to 50%? You can see that tolerance is only 10% for B. So what will happen? But if you ask that question, this increase, you have to assume that the increase is visible. For example, if you're dealing with a chemotherapy protocol, you may add some medication, better medication for nausea, for example, okay? So you do the calculations, and now if you increase it to 50% in tolerance, those are almost the same. So it's a matter of cost effectiveness if you want to use A or B. So this is a simple thing, we're not teaching it. So let me finish my talk with summarizing some of the differences between what I call consequential epidemiology and etiological epidemiology. They're both important, of course. Consequential focus on application, etiological focus on etiology and mechanisms. Consequential favors measures of association based on absolute differences and thus focuses on additive interaction. And etiological favors ratio-based measures of association and focuses on multiplicative interaction. In consequential, a confounding association allows the identification of high-risk group. In etiological, confounding is a bias akin to selection bias. And finally, consequential favors effectiveness, and etiological favors efficacy. On that cheerful note, I'm finished. Thank you very much.
So we have time for questions?
Oh, yeah, questions. I thought I was off the hook.
Moyses, wonderful talk.
I may have some, because I have a hearing loss that my wife denies. She says I only hear what I want to hear. So speak out.
So I wonder two things. Number one is, I know that we have all felt this, there was that editorial on science that talks about epidemiology not being a real science, that we are in between. We are not real statisticians, but we are also not understanding mechanisms. I wonder what are your thoughts about this conundrum that we face every day as epidemiologists.
If epidemiology is science.
Well, how would you answer that question?
I think the easiest answer is to see, look at the impact of epidemiology. And if epidemiology was not a science, what would it be? I mean, this is the easiest way to answer that question. Epidemiology has made incredible contributions to prevention and public health. And that was only possible with epidemiological research, okay? Now, the second way to answer the question is, epidemiology is sort of a hybrid type of science. I don't think it's like astrophysics, for example, or molecular biology. I mean, it's the confluence of lots of different disciplines. You know, a lot of the stuff we do in epidemiology had been done before us by sociologists, by research in education, and so on and so forth. But I don't know what else, how else to answer that question. I would tell them to go read the epidemiology papers.
I will follow up.
The science editor who wrote that editor.
What's your favorite discovery in epidemiology in the last?
In epidemiology in general?
Yes, yes.
Oh boy, there's so many.
Well, your favorite.
The impact, the impact of smoking on lung cancer was enormous. And the impact of air pollution studies on environmental health was also enormous. So there are lots of, I don't have a favorite one. It's like asking, what is your favorite opera?
Moyses, thank you for that nice, I'm trying to keep this up here so you can hear me. Thank you for that nice talk. I've been thinking about this issue, what I would call the silent voice of epidemiology in the context of data analytics and informatics. And I know that AG recently had a nice issue published with really nice papers talking about the future of observational epidemiology and things of that nature. But I'm wondering if you have seen any papers that are coming across your desk or even in other journals where our professionals, our leaders in epidemiology, are talking about what is epidemiology's role in the context of all the analytics and informatics approach. And I heard you say, you know, they're a lot like fishing, you know, types of things, but nobody is really speaking what we bring to the table in the context of some of these methods. So I'm just curious if you're seeing any discussion anywhere, and I've been encouraging Enrique to think about doing that with the journal, because I think we're silent on this issue.
I have not. It's really interesting because I follow some, not just the epi journals, but I also follow the cardiovascular journals. So I'm not familiar with environmental health, reproductive health, and so on and so forth. So I've been reading a lot of papers. Actually, I told my wife, once I step down from the AJE, I'll spend the next 6 months without even reading the newspaper. Because all I seem to do these days is to read. And I have not. I think it's an important question.
Oh, on a related note, with this move towards very, very, very large, you know, pooling lots of studies without any reflection at all on varying levels of quality and what's being lost as things are combined. You know, I think that is the part where, even as epidemiologists, we're letting go of the epidemiology. Do you want to comment on that part too?
You're talking about the big studies with
Yeah, where it's like,
so
it's much better to have lots of data than to think about what the quality of the data is and how comparable the data is.
right. I think I mentioned as one of my hopes for the future that those big data studies, they have, somehow we need quality assurance and quality control. It may be, because they're mainly based, well, there are two types of big studies, okay? One are the consortia. So you have genetic consortia, you have cardiovascular. You know, one of the studies that I'm doing, the MESA, multi-acting study of atherosclerosis, is part of a consortium, in which you have problems of harmonizing the data, etc. But I think that's better, because usually those are studies that have used quality assurance and quality control approaches. Now the other one is, let's use the databases that exist and just lump them together and see what happens. In which case, I think the issues of quality assurance and quality control are overwhelming. They may, I think, you know, it might be a good way to generate hypotheses. So it reminds me of cross-sectional studies that, you know, they are amenable to biases, but they may be a good way to come up with some more specific questions and so on. But to use those studies to infer causality is very dangerous.
Moyses, that was a wonderful talk. You know, being at NIH for quite a while now, one of the big issues, and you really brought it up and made me very happy, when you said you wished epidemiologists would bring in more of the biology and the training and teaching. I couldn't agree with you more. I think what we see here is in this issue of not being able to get at causality, how can we get at causality? And one of the ways is our models, but bringing in the biological, cellular, and molecular with more emphasis on that validation of what we see as association. How do you see in the future NIH can best achieve this? Because it is a criticism of epidemiologists in general.
That's the lack of biological data.
Yeah, there's not enough emphasis on that, and I think you were alluding to that in the talk. I really want to hear more.
I'm not saying that some studies that don't have a strong biological underpinning could not be useful. They could be useful. But I think the knowledge of human biology, I think, will improve development of specific hypotheses. And I think that is a problem, because what happens is that a lot of our students who don't have a lot of background in human biology, they go to the methods track. They want to be methodologists. But even if you want the methodology, there has to be knowledge of human biology. And then, the issue of using all those multiple adjustment models in a mechanical way, not thoughtful way. So, sometimes you have more variables than people, and people still interpret that as reasonable. I don't know what they think. So, it is a big failure, of course, of the last few decades of not having strong human biology components in an epidemiology program, educational program.
Thank you very much for such a nice talk. I have a question. I've been a training PhD student for many, many years. Recently, because of big data consortium, and also I saw your presentation. In fact, also from my point of view, it's very important, which is to encourage a student to design study, generate a hypothesis, to collect data, to publish their own result. The issue is, if they start to do that, they always are very small studies, very, very hard to be published in American Journal of Epidemiology. Instead of let them to do a big data consortium, then much easier to be accepted. So this actually, when I teach a student, I say, if you want to be a statistician, you do the second data analysis. If you want to be epidemiologist, you collect your data, generate your hypothesis to design studies to collect your data. So this is really a puzzle to me, how should we do in the future?
I think you answered that question, right?
Thank you for the great talk. I'd also like to thank you for your textbook, which was my Bible, literally, as a student of epidemiology. It's incredible.
I'll tell my wife.
I have it still in my office here, so it's a really, yeah, I agree. Yes. My question is related to that, and I would probably consider myself a methodologist, and I find similarly to the previous question is that, it is difficult to get papers published without some kind of interesting or novel methods type component, something to hook a reviewer, hook an editor into, oh, this is really neat, this is really interesting. And I find that difficult because as an early career researcher, you have to publish lots, and having interesting methods components is one way of doing that. On the other hand, I don't have a strong biology background, so I can't really rely on that. So I was wondering if you could comment on how to sort of balance those two issues in the context that I think I do agree with you that maybe our programs are now too methods focused, but how we deal with that paradigm.
Yeah, I want to clarify something I said. I hope I didn't give the impression that methods are not important. They're very important. And some of the new methods, particularly those by Hernan and Van Wely, methods that look at mediation analysis. In the old times, you just adjusted for mediators. Now, it's more sophisticated. They're very important. But I still think that human biology is a major gap in epidemiology if they want to become epidemiologists. Because now, apparently, there's a specialty, which is methodologists. Even our department say, he's a methodologist, she's a methodologist. I don't know, maybe I'm old-fashioned. I always thought that to be an epidemiologist, you have to be able to design a questionnaire, come up with a good question, choose a good study design, and understand the methods to the point where you can interpret the output, understand the limitation. You don't have to understand all the details. So there has to be a balance, in my opinion. It's like etiological and consequential epidemiology. One is not more important than the other, but there's a lack of balance, and that has to be restored. And the same goes for methodologists and classical traditional epidemiology.
So thank you for being here, and I want to also thank you for your textbook as you came in. I told you, I think I taught Methods 2 for 15 years, and I read your textbook every year along with the students, and every year it was a richer experience. Just every word of the textbook had meaning, and can't thank you enough for that. Just kind of moving this ahead and thinking about everything you said, from the methods to having a biologic basis, data collection. I was trained, my major advisor was Saxon Graham, and we had to do it all, and I've always appreciated having all those pieces. But I'm finding in the world of epidemiology and science moving forward in translation that you also have to have a team and a network. So right now I'm doing a study that has methods and microbiome, and so I've got bioinformatics and biostatisticians and basic scientists all working on a team. Do you think that is the future, and how do we give our students that concept and how to play well in teams? Could you speak to that for a minute?
So I think epidemiology, like medicine, is becoming, super specialized. For example, I started in 1984 as a cardiovascular epidemiologist. Now today, when you refer to one of my colleagues, you would say, he's a atrial fibrillation epidemiologist. He's a congestive heart failure epidemiologist. And I think it's because of the because the literature is getting overwhelming. People cannot be like Abe Lilienfeld or even Sax Graham. Those people had a broad view of epidemiology. So if you ask me, who are the general epidemiologists in our department? I don't know. I may be the only one because I have to read the HAE papers. So I have to know a little bit about methods, a little bit about cancer, and so on and so forth. Actually, I had a very funny experience. I have arthritis from running. So I go to my orthopedist, and he said, what do you think? I say, I have arthritis. I knew, I want to know what to do. He said, I'm a shoulder guy. I'm going to send you to the knee guy. So today in epidemiology, there's a shoulder guy, there's a knee guy, there's an ankle guy. Actually, Hopkins has the stone guys. So the regular urologists don't deal with kidney stones anymore. You have to go to a stone guy. So in epidemiology, getting there. Is this good or bad? I think it's inevitable. I don't see how, with the development of knowledge, with the accumulation of knowledge, you can aim to be like Lou Curler. Lou Curler is a general epidemiologist. But I don't know if you have anyone like that in Buffalo. Do you? You? That's funny.
Dr. Szklo, thank you for your talk. I've admired your work for such a long time. My name's Gary Giavino. I work on tobacco. And I learned some things today, so thank you for that. I realize as the editor of the journal for so long, you might deal with an issue I often wonder about, which is the role of industry funding. And if it has, it's not a methodological issue, it's more a conflict issue, I guess. And have you seen the role of industry funding at all in the papers that are submitted? Funding. Industry, in other words, there's a concern about bias based on funding source. Lisa Bureau writes about it a lot. Pharmaceutical industry, we know tobacco industry funding of secondhand smoke studies, and there's some concern about food industry funding. Has that issue at all have you dealt at all with that issue with the 50,000 papers, was it, that you've seen over the years?
Well, I think the issue here is publication bias. The source of funding and publication bias. There have been several, not just one or two, meta-analysis. This is a fact, and I'm not saying I'm against or in favor, showing that studies funded by the industry, are much more likely to report positive results than studies funded publicly. So, the journals have a policy, if you have a conflict of interest, you have to declare it. But we don't not accept, we don't reject a paper because of the source of funding. If the paper is good. There may be an exception in the tobacco industry, because that's too much. But in general, we do publish papers funded by the industry. The issue is when you do systematic reviews, then if you do systematic reviews of studies funded by the industry, you'll see a much higher efficacy, effectiveness than the studies that are publicly funded. That's true. That's a fact.
Yeah, welcome you all again. I'm Lina Mu. I'm an associate professor in this department. I'm the director of Global Health Initiative and also the graduate director for MPH program in this department. I've been here for just over 10 years. Very small portion of the 100 years of the legacy. So in the next, the four of us will give you a brief overview of in the last decades what we've been working on. So department has grown many different ways in the last decades, and here I'm very happy to share one small aspect of it in global health. In 2011, Dr. Art Goshen, who's here today, also founded the Office of Global Health Initiative. Also, the office has been engaging all 5 departments from the school. EH has always played a bigger role and contributed significantly to the global health work. In the most recent years, effort has been made to take to the university level and form the community of global health equity. Again, the EH faculty, my colleague Dr. Lam, Dr. Katia Noyes, has been a major player and leadership in that community. I want to highlight some of the global health related research work from this department. Of course, there's a tremendous growing in global health related research. Many of the research has been focused on environmental exposure. Among all the 15 core faculty in this department, 8 of us are working on global health related work. So a group of us working on air pollution, exposure, cancer, cardiovascular disease, birth outcome, child development, and underlying mechanism, biomarker, metabolomics, inflammation, oxidative stress has been one of our focus. My colleague, Dr. Katia Noyes, Dr. Ren, has studied in Uruguay and China to look at heavy metal exposure, lead, arsenic, and on the child, epigenetic changes, and cancer development. Dr. Olson will introduce his work on pesticide in Egypt with Dr. Bonner. A group of us working on lifestyle in population health. One example, Dr. Freudenheim's work in Puerto Rico, look at the diet and breast cancer development. Dr. Laura Smith will introduce her work in Zimbabwe, and I want to say that in the last few years there's a tremendous growth of the interest in child development and health. Several of us has get together and trying to pursue early life exposome and child development. That's one of the efforts we're trying to make. In addition, Dr. Tia Palomo has been working on the social policy on population science, and she has been working on the study in Ghana, Ethiopia, and Tanzania to look at the government social protection programs, how that impact the child, impact the adolescent and their families. So many of the sites you see here are our long-term collaborating sites globally, and has been very successful. From office standpoint, we try to generate more collaborations and research ideas around to address those global health issues. We've been organizing annual global health related seminar series, and also each year we come up with a topic to have a Global Health Day Symposium. This year was our 9th year for Global Health Day Symposium. And those are some of the topics that we've been trying to address. Yeah, those are some of the topics. This year we talked about substance use, local and global health. The previous year we talked about exposome and global health burden. We tried a great effort to build the global connection as well as the local, reach out to the local community. We are one of the WHO PAHO designated collaborating centers for health of the housing. It started from 1990s, and also we work very closely with UNICEF, and many of the faculty are, and has a connection with many of the institute. So we made great effort to reach out to the local community. One of the examples is the refugee house. So Erie County is one of the largest refugee settlement area, and we made effort trying to address those issues. This year was the 6th year of the annual Refugee House Summit. Each year we bring the researcher, UB researcher, healthcare provider, politician, local health agency, and also the community members together, try to identify the issues among the refugee house and how we can work together and address those issues. And each year we have about 170, 80 people attend those events, and it's become a very important local event for refugee house. Of course, among all those global health related activities, trying to engage students. With Dr. Argos's generosity, we have been able to fund a student, graduate student, have the Global Field Work Award to gain experience working in different countries. In the last couple of years, we found a student to go China, Zimbabwe, India, and Kenya. And many of them have gained tremendous experience, and that was valuable for them during their training at UB. So it was 7 minutes given to me, and you can tell I'm trying to speak very, very fast. I want to say that I was very impressed with Dr. Venus yesterday, the presentation about 100 years of review of the Department of History and the legacy. I want to say, and also felt tremendously the pressure as a current faculty, what we should do next to create the history for the next 100 years. And we have so many successful alumni here today, and we do want to have you feedback, opinion, and input, work together to create the next 100 years of legacy for the department. Thank you.
pleasure to be here today. I'm Jim Olson. I direct the Environmental Health Division. And environmental health is a growing and vibrant part of the Department of Epi and Environmental Health at UP. I want to start by really congratulating our class of 2019. These are all of the MPH students that have concentrated in environmental health. And we're really proud of them and the fact that they are initiating their careers, all of them, in fields related to public health. And I wanted to also just introduce the idea that we are planning a new Environmental Health Sciences MS program. We have an adequate core faculty that can really make this program a success. And along with people in the department, we will be interacting with faculty in other departments that are affiliated with the Division of Environmental Health Sciences, the renewed focus area in environmental exposures, genomes, and health, and so on. So I think within our department and the school and UB as a whole, we can have a successful program, and hopefully a year from now we will have something. Whoop. There. History, as all of you know, this is really the Niagara River, Grand Island, and I found this map, 1925. Environmental health has always been an issue in protecting the health of the community. This is Niagara Falls and all the chemical industries that have located here due to cheap hydroelectric power and water, which was plentiful. So again, the value of this industry was huge, even back in 1925. Love Canal, and this actually is an aerial view in 1938. Empty, ideal place for burying waste, but unfortunately a school was built on top of it. Not the greatest picture, but you can see this is a school, playgrounds, and homes. And this is 1978, when this was on the news every night on the national and international stage. So my history, I'm amazed. I've been here for 40 of the last 100 years. Well, actually it's 39. It's a little scary, but it makes me reflect. And how did I end up being affiliated with this department? Well, when I was recruited to the Department of Pharmacology and Toxicology in the medical school. But during my first month, in August of 1980, I think John must have been there with the Love Canal Health Study. Due to my background in dioxins and other persistent chemicals, I was part of this team that really disbanded very quickly because Jimmy Carter was not going to be reelected, CDC was not going to fund that work. And it really wasn't until over 10 years later that I began to work with John. I, being an experimental toxicologist, it was really, I had not really worked with human population-based studies. So this was a great opportunity for me to learn a bit about what's involved. And John, being the leader of the study, and working with Germaine as well, it was really a very exciting time for me. And this then led me to be able to have more interest in really pursuing opportunities to do population-based studies. Still involved with work in Anniston, Alabama, which is a community where PCBs were manufactured, one of 2 sites in the whole U.S. And then more recently, we're still doing studies in Egyptian agriculture workers. Matt Bonner is part of this team. And we have other collaborators, including those in Egypt. Very exciting for me. So I've really benefited a great deal from collaborative, interdisciplinary environmental health research while at UB. And I want to now talk about our faculty. They're the key to the Division of Environmental Health. And I am really fortunate to have these great people. Meng Wang is a new faculty member, came about a year ago. His strength that he's bringing to the division is environmental exposure assessment. He does air pollution modeling and other environmental modeling, looking primarily at respiratory and cardiovascular disease and cancer. And his expertise in, again, assessing air pollution through various approaches, and his past experiences on large international and national health studies makes him a valuable member of our department. Laura Smith, who you'll be hearing from later today, she's, again, a recent addition to our department. And her interesting work in Zimbabwe, looking at determinants of health, effects of diet, and in particular, mycotoxin exposure that is affecting potentially the health of mothers and children in Zimbabwe. And I'm sure you'll hear more from her as I need to zoom through. Kasia Cordes, she provided a great slide for me. And again, Kasia's looking at effects of low-level environmental mixtures on child health, looking specifically at growth and development, IQ, and food as a source of contaminants. And her work is largely school-age kids from Uruguay. And I just had a meeting this week with Marissa, one of her MS students, and she's going to be looking at the effect of pesticides on cognitive function in young kids from Uruguay. Again, interdisciplinary work reflected here with a PhD student in chemistry working with Kasia's team and others that are within the department as well. Zhufeng Ren, again, a recent addition. Well, no, he isn't. He's now tenured and very, studying the toxic effects of heavy metals, in particular mercury, arsenic, and epigenetics is one of his key areas of interest. Lina Mu, you just heard about, again, her perinatal health, child's health, and again, a great faculty member that leads this area of investigation. Matt Bonner, I'll talk about Matt Bonner here. He is leading a health study called the Environmental Health Study for Western New York, and here's the website. Please look at it. It's an interesting, very interesting opportunity to do a prospective cohort study of current and former residents of the city and town of Tonawanda and the town of Grand Island. And the objective is to assess environmental exposures to coke oven emissions, related chemicals, and their relationship to health, and learn how to prevent environmentally caused diseases in the future. Recruitment was started last year. We're collecting specimens, doing GIS modeling of air pollution, doing community outreach and education, and we have a great team that is ever expanding. It includes a number of members of our department. And here's some of the recruitment data we have so far, over 12,000 participants from all the zip codes in these regions. And again, it's a pleasure to make a quick introduction here, and I got to pass it off to the next speaker.
Good morning, everybody. This is a great pleasure and an honor to welcome you in Buffalo, for those of you who have been in Buffalo before. My role is today to present our newest division of Health Services Policy and Practice. And the division is only 3 years old, so I have much easier task to present 3 years in 7 minutes. I'm happy to do that. I have multiple roles. In addition to being a division director, I also have an appointment at Roswell Park, since most of my research is focused on cancer. And I direct Center for Surgical Outcomes Research for Great Lakes Health System. So the story of our division actually goes back to this cup. So if you want another copy, there are some of them left in the hallway. But when I just started in the department 3 years ago, John Brazier gave me a whole box of them and says that they're no longer relevant, so feel free to have any. Actually, for the history of our division, they are the most relevant because the connection between epidemiology and policy goes back to social medicine. And those of you may know that the concept, the fundamentals of social medicine were originally introduced by a German physician, Rudolf Virchow, in the late 19th century. And this fundamental framework of social medicine is what gave Bismarck the idea to implement government-sponsored universal healthcare insurance, the first one in the universe. So the scientific field of inquiry of social medicine was further developed by another British physician, John Ryle, that published extensively after the Second World War, and that's how the Commonwealth countries all focused on universal healthcare insurance that combine social, economic, and environmental factors to understand the health of population in addition to epidemiologic risks. And not surprisingly, understanding population health is very complex in the current environment that's constrained by multiple policies, very complicated healthcare delivery system, and guided by new technology, politics, policies, employment changes, and numerous other factors that we all are familiar with but poorly understand. And so it's no longer enough to understand what causes a disease. It's also very important to provide evidence for decision making, to how to manage a disease and how to provide adequate access to patients and populations to necessary care. So the health services research is actually now a formally accepted phase in a continuum of research that those of us who do translational work call it T3, T4 translation, but it's really the phase of translating from bedside to real life and clinical practice. So I have greatest thanks to express to the UB Provost, Chip Zukowski, to the Dean Rostovsky Wendy, to our chair, Dr. Freudenheim, for developing a vision and putting together resources to start the division. I was recruited here in 2016, and we just continue hiring our faculty. So we have 3 full-time tenure-track faculty with expertise in surgical outcomes, economics, and public policy. And so my work primarily focused on understanding regional barriers to care delivery for cancer patients and survivors, and developing models to overcome those barriers and improve access to care and outcomes for cancer patients. The current R21 NCI-funded study that we're recruiting for is specifically focused on remote delivery of problem-solving skills therapy to cancer survivors and their caregivers to facilitate access to guideline-recommended cancer survivorship services in the areas that have very poor physician access. So in my role as a chair, as a director for surgical outcomes, we have several studies looking at improving quality of surgical services and treating patients that receive surgical care as a part of a treatment paradigm, whether it's a surgical oncology, trauma, transplant, and many other areas. So among our faculty, Jessica Chow, who is a junior faculty in our division. Her research focused on 2 main areas. So she's a behavioral economist by training from Cornell. And so one of her main areas of interest is looking at the impact of intimate partners on patients' decision-making about preventive services, such as flu vaccination and hypertension management. And the other area of research that she's doing in a collaboration with another department in the School of Public Health, the Department of Rehab Medicine, is understanding impact of national policy on inpatient rehabilitation services use and outcomes. Jessica, wave. People can see you there. All right. We have a postdoc, Denise Lilvis. We have a joint training program, T32, between our division and Department of Family Medicine. And Denise is the first joint fellow. She's a PhD in Health Services Organization and Policy from Michigan. And her work is focused on maternal and child policy, looking at the interplay between state and federal policy, physician workforce, and children outcome, primarily when it comes to immunization and immunization waivers. Christina Crabtree-Eid, Christina is here somewhere, over there, is our first PhD student. So we don't have a PhD program in health services, but we started a new concentration in the EPI PhD program. So Christina's project is focused on understanding how county factors influence individual patient behavior in explaining the access to primary care services, primarily focusing on the rural population. So, Christina is working with another AP graduate. Where is Kelly? Kelly Kemp? Kelly is right there as well. And Kelly generously shared the data that they collected in Upper Peninsula in Michigan, looking at patient demographics and utilization of healthcare, and overlapping it with Robert Wood Johnson Foundation County Health Index that collects comprehensive information about county health behaviors. So our second PhD student is Amy Shaver. Amy, here, right there. So Amy is a clinical pharmacist by training, and she's also a postdoctoral fellow on our Cancer T32. Her work is focused on two related areas. So again, looking at the impact of national health policies such as ACA on outcomes in non-elderly cancer survivors, so patients under Medicare eligibility age, looking at their out-of-pocket expenses, financial toxicities, and understanding what drives patient satisfaction with care. Her dissertation project is focused on head and neck cancer, which is rare but very complex cancer with some viral etiology, but very challenging multidisciplinary management. And she's looking at it both from point of view of so body composition impact of anti-inflammatory medication that these patients may be taking, and looking how it may impact their comorbidity management and cancer treatment. So we also have several staff members, Jing Ni, right there in the back, who works with several of our faculty and fellows. And so Rainier Narvaez was the first surgical resident who did a 2-year fellowship with our division, got his MPH, and his work is primarily focused in transplant surgery outcomes and understanding various challenges related to waitlisting and minority access to transplants. Ajay Mineni, Ajay, right there. So Ajay is a graduate from our department, has a PhD in epi, and he joined our surgical outcomes group last year as assistant director. And he leading several projects on surgical outcomes, including our current project on understanding racial and gender disparities in access to bariatric surgery and weight management treatment. And the newest member of our division is Lauren Miller. She's a PhD candidate in biostatistics, and her role is a data analyst. So all of the studies that I described are based on analysis of large databases, registries, and population-based data. And so we have numerous data sets from electronic medical record, REDCap, various data abstraction systems like I2B2, as well as national databases, both surgical, cancer, hospital, and providers. So all of this work that happens in the division, of course, doesn't happen in a vacuum. We have extensive collaborations with other departments and groups in the School of Public Health, as well as in the School of Medicine and other research organizations locally and nationally. And of course, a lot of our work is very much applied work with our community partners, including rural outreach centers. We started new projects working with minority population in Black churches and local healthcare systems. So as Dr. Vina said yesterday, collaboration is really the way going forward, and we are very interested and open to new collaborations. New data, new training, sharing experience. Happy to share our data and approaches with anybody. Thank you very much, and happy to see you.
So as you see, there are several divisions within the department. There's not officially a division of epidemiology, but I'm going to talk a little bit about the epidemiology piece within the department. So these are the areas of focus, as you've just seen. So There's a large number of epidemiology-focused faculty within the department listed here. We have close collaborations with Roswell Park, and so there are faculty there who mentor our students, work closely. And then we have 2 new faculty who are coming this fall, who will be part of the new undergraduate public health teaching faculty. So it's exciting. So you've heard a little bit about the Environmental Health Division. There are a number of faculty who are doing environmental epidemiology. Lina Mu, so Lina fits into many of the categories like a good epidemiology. There's a lot of overlaps in the Venn diagrams. She's doing work on air pollution and pregnancy outcomes and air pollution in the metabolome in Beijing. Matthew Bonner, Jim mentioned his work in looking at pesticide applicators in Egypt and the cognitive impacts of those exposures, and then this new cohort that he and Jim are working on, as well as others, on health effects of coke oven emissions in northwestern Erie County. And then Kasia Cordes, you heard also about. She's doing work on interactions of nutritional and environmental exposures among children in Uruguay. In the global health group, so Kasia, Lina, and Matthew also fit into this category, and then and actually Jim had Laura in the environmental category, which I would agree with too. Laura's doing work on mycotoxins, and a recent member of the faculty who's now left is Pavani Ram, who's been doing work on water sanitation and hand washing in relation to child health and development in low and middle income countries. So in addition to the PhD students, so we have had epidemiology students who have had a focus on health services research. Katia mentioned Christina Crabtree-Ide. There are 2 other students, Maggie DeVita and Jacqueline Mix, who many of you know and have worked with, who did work on inpatient rehabilitation patients using epidemiology methods. So a combination, again, of health services and epidemiology. So with a focus more specifically on just epidemiology, I would include Mike Lamont, who's done a lot of work on physical activity, physical function, and health outcomes, particularly among aging women. And then more recently, he's been doing work with Jean Wachtowski-Wendy and her group on the microbiome and aging, including cardiovascular outcomes. And then finally, his work is on cardiovascular disease, including heart failure and healthy aging. Amy Millen has done work on nutritional epidemiology of aging, including effects on the microbiome, and then a great deal of work on the epidemiology of eye disease. Heather Oakes-Balcom is focused primarily on genetic epidemiology, looking at copy number variation, and recently some work on people who are heterozygous for sickle cell disease. Haley Bannock, who's a new member of the department, is focused on aging, especially body composition in relation to health outcomes, and then she's done a lot of work on methods related to bias in epidemiologic studies. Jean Wachtowski-Wendy, who is now the dean, still has a very vibrant research program going, looking at women's health, especially postmenopausal women, on fracture and osteoporosis. She is leading a group looking at the microbiome and the metabolome among aging women, and a fair amount of work looking at periodontal disease and systemic health. And then myself, DNA methylation in relation to the use of electronic cigarettes, the microbiome in breast tissue among women with breast cancer, and then we've been doing work on factors related to prognosis among women with breast cancer. So, and there's just some, just to brag just a little bit on some of the highlights of recent work. Mike Lamont led a paper that on physical activity and heart failure was the largest and most comprehensive paper to date on that topic, and he's been doing work looking at light physical activity even below the guideline recommendations and how the kind of very important health impacts that has. In the area of the microbiome, There's been a number of studies on prospective associations of periodontal disease with total cancer as well as specific cancers. Also, prospective associations of periodontal disease with blood pressure, hypertension, and other cardiovascular outcomes. And then there's new work in that group looking at changes in the oral microbiome over time and how that relates to periodontal disease and other health outcomes. And then some work on the breast microbiome and breast cancer characteristics. You've heard some about the work being done on pesticides. Another piece of work was looking at associations of occupational pesticide use and lung cancer in the agricultural health study, occupational use of chlorpyrifos and ADHD among adolescent applicators. And then there's a great deal of work in the department that Jim referred to, looking at air pollution, effects on metabolomics, effects on early life, subclinical arterial disease, and also DNA methylation in breast tumors. And then in eye disease, there's been a number of studies looking at different factors in the diet in relation to eye disease, and as well as a recent work looking at radiation exposure among radiation techs and the effects on cataract. Child growth and development is an area. So there was a time when people complained that the only work in the department was cancer. So that's been changed. There's a broader range of topics of interest. Child growth and development work includes the work on heavy metal exposures and cognition, diet composition in relation to heavy metal exposures, aflatoxin exposures, and inflammation among pregnant women in Zimbabwe, and the effects of hand hygiene and perinatal morbidity and mortality. DNA methylation as a marker of exposure and as a biomarker of effects. I've been doing some of that work, as has Dr. Wren. Associations of sleep and sleep quality with telomere length, and associations of sleep with breast cancer incidence and mortality. I'm getting there. Genetics, identification of novel genetic variants associated with familial breast cancer among African American women. So Heather Oakes-Balcom has put together a group of women, African American women with familial breast cancer, trying to identify genes beyond the BRCA gene, and also genetic factors relation to fracture risk among postmenopausal women, factors related to prognosis, women who had breast cancer, looking at morbidity and mortality in that group. We have a large number, or fair number of graduate programs in epidemiology. The PhD in epidemiology has been mentioned, the MS in epidemiology, and now we have a subgroup within that with a clinical research focus, and then within our MPH there's an epidemiology concentration. Thank you very much.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. So this is really a distinct honor to introduce my great friend. I'm going to give a little bit of the background of Germaine. Germaine Lewis graduated from this program a few years ago. And he introduced to many of us to the love for reproductive epidemiology. Germaine was also the Division Director and Branch Chief of the Epidemiology Branch of the NICHD for many years, and my boss, so now I can say whatever I want because she's not my boss anymore, having become the Dean of the School of Public Health at George Mason's University. Now, what makes Germaine different than many people is that she has dedicated her life not only to reproductive epidemiology and her family, but to mentoring. And I have to say that I have many mentors in my life, really, really good ones. But I have one role model, only one role model, and that's Germaine for me. Is that good enough, Pauline? She always had that, she always had that. Through the Germaine is a role model for whatever it becomes, the ethical standards, how to do the right thing, even when it's hard, and that's hard to teach. So every time I face a situation, I have to decide what would be the right thing to do. I always think is what Germaine will do. So with that, thank you, and thank you for being here.
Well, thank you, Enrique, for that. I will try to live up to it. It's really great to be back, and I'm just in awe of what they've done with Hayes Hall. So whoever was responsible for that, be sure they get my heartfelt praise for this. So when Joe asked me if I would say a few words about how we went about trying to build repro and perinatal epidemiology in the department, I thought, oh wow, this is really an opportunity, because we all know that SPM and EEH now was characterized by fantastic cancer epidemiology, by outstanding nutritional epidemiology, moving into cardiovascular epidemiology. But what is often overlooked is repro and perinatal epi. So I want to tell you about the other side. And John did a very good job talking about 150 years ago and moving forward, how our department played a major role in epidemiology. And I want to stand in front of you and say, I'm going to talk about the first 30 years of the field in repro and perinatal epidemiology and what SPM, as I knew it, its role was in developing the field of repro and perinatal epidemiology. And for the students in the room, you should be very proud to know that the alum ahead of you, many of them sitting here in this room, are the international leaders in this field, all from here. So, one graduate at a time. So, I wanted to just take a moment to remind myself about having lost two wonderful doctoral students, Tijan Wu and Julie Baker. And as a mentor, you never expect to lose your students before you leave. And I also want to acknowledge Ron Batt, who was the only gynecologic faculty member in the School of Medicine who was willing to talk to me to help develop repro epi. And everything I learned about endometriosis came from Ron. And I'm hoping by the end of my career, I will live to see if his idea that endometriosis really is an in utero disease, that it originates in utero, comes to light, as increasing evidence now is suggesting. So, in remembrance of these three individuals. So, this is only my reflection, how repro epi got started at UB, and you're free to differ, but this is my view, and so it's got to be right from my perspective. So actually, a lot of my early career I credit to medical sociology, the social sciences on the other campus at the time. And it's also a lot of the early behavioral work, the interest in lifestyle and behavioral factors and how it might influence health. And I particularly remain appreciative of Graham Kerr, who's a sociologist on faculty there, who took a chance on me and helped me learn the health behavioral model so I could apply it to adolescent decision-making in using contraception. And this was in the era after abortion was legalized, like trying to understand how adolescents might use contraception and even abortion. I learned demography. I learned how to do life table analysis by hand under Garrett Karras, and let me tell you, that was a hard course, and I do remember him in the very first graduate day of class asking why women were in the room, because women didn't need graduate education. I think he was kidding. But I also, learned structural equation, path analysis, and qualitative methods. And these have really shaped my career. And as I would kid Enrique, when DAGs became all the rage in epidemiology, I'm like yawning, because DAGs are just a small part of path analysis. The way that I was thinking, I couldn't understand why people were thinking of this as so novel, when in fact, specifying a model and then trying to look at direct or indirect or total effects seemed so new. So anyways, that was just my background. And I was really appreciative that my master's thesis working with Dr. Kerr resulted in a publication. So in 80 to 87, when I was doing my doctorate, there were no formal courses in reproductive, perinatal, or pediatric epidemiology on campus or in the medical school, and there were no databases, nor was there datum. So if you have a passion and there are no resources, what do you do? So I had the good fortune of having Art Meiklath, and I'm sorry he's not here, so I can thank him in person, to serve as a mentor, as he would call himself. I'm an old cancer guy. I don't know anything about this repro stuff, but he made calls on my behalf to the New York State Department of Health, to another cancer guy, Phil Nasca, and Phil said, I'll look around to see if there's somebody who can work with her. So the health department, SIDS was all the rage. The epidemiology of SIDS was not well known. So the Commissioner of Health wanted the health department to be focusing on SIDS. I was more interested in reproduction, but I'm like, okay, somebody will at least say yes to me, and that was what I did. So in 19 through 2000, largely being on faculty, I was really committed to developing graduate courses, one in repro, one in perinatal, and then ethics courses focusing on issues and controversy in this particular field, and had a great time with students who always were waging bets whether or not I was pregnant, because I had 4 children along the way, and they always were wondering, is she pregnant or is she not pregnant? But of course they didn't tell me this until I was leaving, so I never knew this was going on. But I also want to acknowledge, and this is important, I think, for the students in the room, I leveraged the medical school faculty, and in fact, a lot of my identification is with Roswell and the medical school, because there wasn't a school of public health formed yet. So I have a lot of identities with those individuals. And I had the good fortune of meeting Mike Massall and Brian Rogers, who were developmental pediatricians working at the Robert Warner Rehabilitation Center. They were tenure-track faculty. They needed people who could help them understand data and design studies. I needed them for access to patient populations and to be able to do studies. So I went from perinatal, SIDS, to pediatrics with them. But my most important paper came from that collaboration. Brian Rogers one day said to me, and this is in the era of cardiac surgery, and all the big cardiac surgeons, pediatric cardiac surgeons, saving babies all over the world. And because they were developmental pediatricians, they dealt with the aftermath of kids with hypoplastic left heart syndrome, which tends to occur in healthy, uneventful pregnancies with no warning and is incompatible with life. So the options were for families to do palliative care or the heroic surgeries to try to save the babies. And one day Brian said to me, Germaine, I see all of these kids in clinics, coming back in the developmental clinics for years, and they have no quality of life. They can't do the activities of daily living. So we presented the first case series of kids undergoing major cardiac surgery for hypoplastic left heart syndrome, and guess what? The developmental disability rates were off the charts. And then we could trace it back to time on pump when they were undergoing the surgeries. And to this day, it's cited by important work, and it is a case series study. But it really made people think past cardiac ejection fraction, oh, the new heart's working really well, to what does it mean for the family and the child. So a lot of good things came from that. So I'm forever appreciative to those early people. But I didn't get to pick the projects. And I think that's my message to the students. And John said this yesterday, take advantage of the opportunities. Because I knew I was proving myself, right? So, and eventually I'll get there. Okay. And I just want to say again, I owe everything to the New York State Department of Health, the oldest vital registries in the country, keep that in mind, who allowed me to do a population-based nested case control study on SIDS, and the health commissioner, under public health law, signed off so I could access all the medical records of the kids without individual consent. Imagine that. And so when I went to all these hospitals across the state for data abstraction, I was met with donuts and coffee because they thought the health department was coming in. It was just a doctoral student. So I didn't always clarify, but I did not misrepresent myself either. So I want to pick up on John's point again about taking opportunities. And you can have a very straight trajectory in your career, and that's fine. I'm not putting that down. But my career has been made better by taking some chances, and that means starting as a nurse, first generation student going to college in my family, but I met and fell in love with public health. The passion, I think, that John talked about yesterday. As a graduate student, there are no training grants in this area. I'm going to come back to that in a little bit, but I had a nursing degree. So I worked full-time and went to school full-time. I had no repro mentors that were here, no data, as I mentioned, but I did find passion in other mentors who could help me in other ways and who could make connections for me. So at UB on faculty, yes, I was on mommy track. Do you remember that? I shared that line with Lisa Monagle for the early part of my career, which was then split between graduate education and undergraduate medical education for epi and biostats because Jim left and I got the course. So, but also doing a lot of pediatric research, and I kept thinking, when can I get to the repro stuff? How long do I have to do the shoe leather? So when I got contacted by the search committee to look at epidemiology intramurally at NICHD, and they wanted somebody to build repro epi in a training program. I'm like, and they're going to pay me? Unbelievable. So I call it my reproductive epi honeymoon. I would have never, ever been able to do the kind of research that is shown here, and I'll just mention these very quickly, without taking this move. And I remember Maurizio saying, how can we retain you? What do you need? I'm like, you can't give me this opportunity. So I'm going to save you the work. I'm not staying because I want to do this opportunity. But also, some of the other major accomplishments that we had globally. Our Summer Institute, I'll tell you in a minute, how we went behind the scenes and influenced our institute to release program announcement for T32s in repro and perinatal epi, both pre and postdoctoral. We have the ability to do that influence. So, and now I'm at Mason. We're transitioning our College of Health and Human Service into a College of Public Health because Virginia has no independent school or College of Public Health. And for the first time in my life, my bosses, the president and the provost, appreciate and want public health, as does the Board of Visitors. So this is a real opportunity to build and to have impact. So the opportunities that came along for me for well-oiled machines never put that spark in, but the idea to truly impact the population's health in addition to the academics was just too much. I had to do it. So this just summarizes, started in perinatal with SIDS to a lot of time in pediatrics, finally going to repro, but this is what I know. Moving forward, that fecundity and fertility is in the pathway to later health and disease across the lifespan. and by understanding the early signals that manifest in reproductive health, I think it will transform how we think about other diseases. And in fact, the data, population level data, already showing endometriosis, you need to be thinking about cancer. It's going to happen. It's just going to take a little bit of time. Why is that? PCOS, we know it's metabolic disease, semen quality and mortality. Guys with poor semen quality start dying 7 years faster than men with higher semen quality. We are, this generation, and I know they can do it, because I can see what they have done, are going to be the ones that make those discoveries and transform how we even think about, I think, health as well as clinical medicine. So I want to take a few words to brag about what graduates of this program have done on the international stage. My New York State Angler prospective pregnancy cohort study team, I have had this photo in my office since I left here. It was, still is, one of a handful of preconception prospective pregnancy studies with daily capture of lifestyle for up to a year of trying in the world. In the world. And we did find some of the earliest empirical data that specific PCD congeners, particularly the anti-estrogenic ones, diminish fecundity. Another fun thing, and because of how well designed this study was by this team, and everything that we've done has been a team, we actually knew how many days it took people to get pregnant. And so a decade later, one of, I think she was Maureen Cooney, was a summer student at the time. We did a follow-up study of the women who participated in the Angler study. This is only half of the babies. Had the same stationery from the original study. We called them. They sort of remembered being in the study. But you know what got us to nearly 100% follow-up after a decade was Marianne Snyder, the nurse researcher who worked with these couples. They all remembered Marianne. And the answer is, it's not well recalled at all. Bidirectional errors. And so I am always cautious in chronic disease models when I'll see a variable time to pregnancy fraught with error. It's probably good for conception delay at 6 months or infertility, but that's about it. One of the few validity studies on recall time to pregnancy. So, Jim, do you remember how hungover you were in this photo? I just want to, and Frank, you know, and here's their poor graduate student. This is what they did. I just want to emphasize that in the seriousness of the work and responsibility of the work, a point that John made yesterday, it's okay to have some downtime to do some reflection. And this was, I think, the first Great Lakes meeting. I think it was someplace in Hamilton, Ontario, or I can't remember, somewhere up there. But Linda Birnbaum was there, Pauline, Larry Needham, Ed Fitzgerald. We had a lot of fun while doing good work. So at NICHD, again, the team concept, I don't think team science, I think it's old news at this point. I can't imagine anybody working alone. There's no way you can be totally well-versed when it comes to understanding human health. But my honeymoon project, the life study, when the study section said that you couldn't recruit couples preconceptionally and follow them during trying. So in Angler, we had to take out the males and only put in the females. I went right to NICHD and put males back in. And it was really important because what we observed, it's the male concentration of many of these chemicals that drives the couple response, whether it's pregnancy loss or time to pregnancy. And if we only looked at females, we would have had an entirely different conclusion. So I'm delighted to hear from my colleagues now when they put in a preconception study, and if they only have women, the study sections are saying, you need to have males, so my work is done. Our endo study, we couldn't have done this. I started at the Buffalo Women's Health Study before we left, And it was what I needed to show that we can work with laparoscopic surgeons, right? And I used to be an OR nurse, so I knew what they were going to have to do to be able to get peritoneal fluid, ectopic endometrial implant, eutopic endometrium, and the usual kinds of things to measure the chemicals, endomental fat, because that's really where the lipophilic chemicals are. So we have the best available data in the world on this question, and it was really nice to see some recent major meta-analysis studies. And when you see the best data comes from the endo study by your esteemed peers, you know you've done something right. And this is, again, a big, I owe a great deal to Ron for turning me on to the excitement about endometriosis. Upstate kids, I designed this study, but then got a second job in addition to my full-time, and my great colleague, Duena Young, took this over. And this was working with the health department to answer the question, does infertility a treatment affect gestation and birth size? As most of these small clinical studies were saying it did. And we found out it doesn't at the population level. No, and we thought that was great news. So parents can relax and not to have to worry about what's going to happen with their children. But interestingly in this study, because we talked to both parents and got their health histories, we all know things like diabetes affects birth size and hypertension diminishes fetal size. But actually, a history of infertility had a much stronger effect than any of the other chronic diseases that we always pay attention to. So it was really a great work, and she's continuing to follow these kids to look at cardiometabolic health. In our fetal growth studies, something we just finished, answering the questions, should all babies, irrespective of race or ethnicity, under optimal maternal conditions grow the same way? Long-standing clinical argument. Finally, we said, this is measurable. This is an answerable question. And all the obstetric ultrasound machines the algorithms are based on about 200 white women from the 70s. And in case you haven't noticed, the obstetrical population looks very different, if nothing else in terms of BMI. So what we found is basically you need race ethnic specific standards to prevent misclassifying fetuses as growing at a slow or suboptimal rate. All measurement error and bias in my view. So this all felt very good, and I was really tired. But right before I left, our division was celebrating its 50th anniversary. Our institute was only 55 years old, which meant that the early leaders of the institute had already an early appreciation for the value of public health. And so we worked with a biblioinformatician to put together all the publications from everybody who had ever been in the division to see where we're having an impact. The size of the circles are the number of papers and things of that nature. And I just want you to know that a lot of people, graduate students from our program and colleagues are represented in our map here. So it was just a fun thing to do to see where we were having impact. So I want to say a few words about the contagion of mentoring. In the words of NIH, mentoring matters, and mentoring is everyone's business. And it's always stayed with me. I think this is something that we need to invest in, just like investing in raising your children well have lifelong implications. So I want to talk about 3 doctoral students who continued on to work in repro and perinatal epi. And I apologize to anybody who had a slightly different path. In the interest of time, I can't talk about everybody. But I'm not claiming these 2 as mine, but they did see the light coming to my class. So, you know, Enrique was a cardiovascular. He was all hyped up. I remember, like, oh, big cardiovascular came to repro, and the seduction hit. Michael, long-term, you know, environment and cancer guy, came to repro. He was always late. But, you know, one day he was there in time, and so we gave him a round of applause. But I claim these 2 in part for coming to the field. So Pauline, my very first doctoral student, whose PhD was on spontaneous fetal death and PCB contaminated fish consumption, one of the very first and certainly the best paper on this topic. And not surprisingly, she won the Student Prize Paper Award, but not once, but twice that year. And in a lot of the pictures where you see semi-naked people on the beach, was all in celebration of Pauline. This was when SCR and SBR were in Miami. So she just had this smile on her face all week long because everybody was buying her drinks and things like that. But we really celebrated. We were so proud of her. And then to pick up the second award that same year, well, it made me very proud too. But I can tell you, she might have been nervous giving her talks. I had enough anxiety and nervousness for both of us, right? I know she can do it, I know she can do it, and she did. And then she went on to have leadership roles at the EPA, additional leadership roles at the National Center for Health Statistics, and joining NICHD, continuing to expand great work in air pollution and asthma in pregnant women and a whole host of other things. And just, if you look at her CV, incredible professional leadership and a whole host of awards. So what you may not know is, I asked each of them, what do you think were your most important discoveries? And this is a paper that Pauline did with her postdoctoral fellow from Finland. And they were the first to really look and to report that elevated blood pressure is associated with chronic disease risk, and that environmental factors such as temperature and ozone affected pregnancy loss and related outcomes during labor and delivery. And this paper is really important because we often don't think about pregnant women as being a vulnerable group in terms of air and things of that nature. And with all the changes in our climate forthcoming or upon us already, this is really an important piece. So Donnell followed, and her dissertation is Conception Loss and Pregnancy Outcome. She cleaned up in 2002, winning 3 major awards. Also, she won a number of other types of research and poster awards even before her dissertation, and I took it off the slide because I thought it would embarrass you to have them all. So, Donnell has worked at the EPA on a whole host of environmental exposures and health, and is a strong champion for reproductive and pediatric health. So I feel better about the EPA and their risk assessments and the policy because I know she's there. And she's certainly not the only one advocating for vulnerable populations. And her career has been devoted to making sure we have the empirical science for risk assessment and policy agendas. And I don't have to tell anybody in this room what tough work this is currently. So Paula, now she humbled me because she wanted to study ALL. I'm like, what do I know about cancer? But I had to learn. And as you may know, Paula has recently retired from SUNY Upstate, but has been on faculty for quite some time. And she had the opportunity to look at environmental exposures following her dissertation and the health of children in Kenya, rural elderly populations, so again, the vulnerable populations, as well as communities affected by environmental disasters such as Anniston. And she felt that her greatest discovery was understanding the role of adolescent exercise for bone development and osteoporosis prevention, and independent of what was current thinking related to muscle mass and things of that nature. The importance of exercise for bone development in reproductive age women. Enrique Schisterman had to have a very long title for his dissertation, unlike the candidates before him, but we'll blame that on the cardiovascular influence. But he, Maurizio, as you may know, was his major mentor, but he made us proud serving as president of SPER during its 25th anniversary. also our current president of SER, and as you heard, our new editor-in-chief, and a whole host of awards and recognitions. And we remember this when he graduated. Before he graduated, you see the hair loss between those two. And in his role as I think this was from SPER, but maybe it was another time with Robert Platt, a good colleague of his. So Enrique, just like a long title, he had to have more than one discoveries too. So he asked me to mention, he has been a long-standing methodologist, but has worked very hard to integrate cardiovascular and reproductive health. And that is really, I think, the beauty of his interventional research. And as you may know, he has published the large randomized clinical trial that shows that among women with a history of miscarriage, taking a baby aspirin is associated with an improvement in live birth rates. A low-tech solution to a very common problem. And in terms of methods, a lot of great work with the team looking at pooling designs, how to pool biospecimens, for example, when you don't have resources to do individual measurement or for other reasons, and focus on bias, the separation of over-adjustment and unnecessary biases. So Michael Bloom actually finished up after I left, and then we had the good fortune to recruit him as a postdoc with us, and he went on to win the student prize paper and is a major reviewer in the top clinical journals in human reproduction. And when I asked him, he's in China right now, he thought one of the most important discoveries is understanding that follicular HDL concentrations were associated with sociodemographic characteristics that then impacted IVF outcomes. And his recent work looking at in utero phthalate exposure in racially and ethnic diverse groups and anal genital distance in boys, which is a new marker of a reproductive hit to the GU tract in males. So just quickly about how else has this department impacted the globe in our field. So I know Andrew Kramer had to leave, but SPER got started in 1986 very informally because SER never accepted the repro and perinatal abstracts. And people were upset. They just couldn't get on the program. And as it became increasingly difficult to travel and people needed to be on the program to travel, it was a career stopper, actually. And so a small group, myself included, we met. We had an unofficial meeting in 1988. We had our very first meeting. And so these were three folks affiliated with our department. We're at the table at the time the society was being conceived, no pun intended. And Danelle, who has served as treasurer, will relate to this because we had no money in the beginning and Andrew was treasurer, and we had to lug everything with us because there was no staff. So, and when SER, so thereby SPER, was in Buffalo in 1991, we took all the major key players to Niagara Falls and we did a little tourist. Here's just conversation going, great minds arguing, great students having fun. And we have Laureen there, and who's here, Kim, and Tijan, who's no longer with us. And I have to say, I was very proud in 2010 to receive the Mentoring Award from the Society, but not as proud as the following year when my student, former student, received the Mentoring Award for a whole host of students that she had mentored, largely from UNC, who had won all kinds of prize paper awards too. That was the poetic justice of investing in mentoring, I think. So Joe mentioned a few of this, but I wanted to summarize. So when I say that this department has been instrumental from the start in building repro and perinatal epi internationally, this is why. You'll see that we've had 3 treasurers. Danelle has done such a good job, so every time the organization was starting to go belly up, they brought her back, and she said yes. But we've had 3 different presidents, we've had 3 different prize papers, and we've had 2 mentoring awards, and I'm hoping that the current students and faculty will continue to be involved and advance the field. Because I was frustrated that there were no T32s for repro and perinatal in the country, not to mention just at UB, so working behind the scenes, this is exactly what we did. We took the data, went through all the training grants in the country, showed our institute director of all the 176 or something that they funded, there was nothing in this area, and how could our country be talking about a national children's study when we didn't even have a mechanism to train our students? So this does not appear on my CV anyway, but so proud that this program announcement was released. I was very disappointed, I have to say, because I sent it to Buffalo, was hoping they would go after it. But I was happy for these institutions that at least initially, I think this was open for 10 years, that were able to go after and build the repro training grant mechanism. So. And this was our summer institute, so before the training grants, we wanted to make sure there was a cadre, there was a way to bring repro and perinatal epi to the forefront. So working with our Canadian colleagues at CIHR, we pooled money to recruit students throughout the globe. We could only afford 12 to come to one of 8 summer institutes, week-long intensive deep dive curriculum opportunity. And it resulted in 157 different students being selected from 14 countries and 73 academic institutions. And it's great. When we see these students at meetings or whatever, they all identify as a cohort. What cohort were you? And it's all based on location. And Julie Baker was our sole US participant in the summer institutes. So that was a lot of fun and a lot of work. It resulted in a textbook, a classroom textbook with curriculum. And the curriculum came from the faculty's curriculum, but also the years of questions from the students. And they were some pretty savvy students. So we think that this is really a textbook that is student authored. I have long been asked, do you really think human fecundity is changing? Is it true that semen quality is declining so rapidly and everywhere? Testes cancers are going up. Gynecologic and urologic diseases are increasing prevalence. And I'm like, I don't know, but it's answerable, right? And so one of the powers of being at NICHD is we could actually bring in the best minds from multiple disciplines, from the social sciences, the demographers, the leading demographers, you name it, all the clinical folks, to say, is this an answerable question? Because we knew if we published it, we could give power to individuals who wanted to go after grants to try to look at this question. And I'm really proud to say that, again, our department was well represented in this work and in this publication, leading the future direction. How can we answer this question? So just a reminder, it doesn't just happen. You can't do it without great mentors. Former student Jeff Bethany here, a worm guy, one of the world's leading hookworm and schisto guy. Let me say that again. One of the world's leading hookworm and schisto guy, a graduate of this program. And Laureen, and I don't know what we were doing here. I can't remember if this was your graduation or Carlos with something. Oh, that was yours? Okay. And Carlos. So we also had a lot of fun, underscoring John's point that it's not all work. But again, good colleagues that really helped me, my 2 Johns, as I always call them, John Weiner and John Vina. And I see that, John, I'm just going to do this photo because I saw it up there. But for the right amount of money, I've got an even better one. I knew we were in public company and Sylvia wasn't going to be here. No, wouldn't do that to you.
It was in Miami.
Yes, it was all Pauline's her fault.
That's when OJ got,
Yeah.
Bronco going down the road.
Yeah. Oh, you didn't know that till you got back to your room at night because you were on the beach. Anyway, so I'm here now working to transition our college, and one of the unique opportunities, this is a brand new building. I arrived in November. In January we moved into it. Mary had a chance to see it. I didn't have to raise any funds for this building, and it's really great. But also how lucky we are. In the back here is a two-story it's a population health clinic that we have. Has a functional MRI in it. We have unbelievable telehealth capabilities. So we're really looking forward to impacting the community in a narrow sense and a larger sense. Yeah, it's brilliant. So Mason is the first and only university in the country that has robots that will deliver nutritional options to students, faculty, and we just finished exam season, and you would see all these signs and advertisement. Call us, more time to study. They'll come right to you, watch them, you have to share all the sidewalks. They are phenomenal robots, they're a lot of fun. But what kind of fit is this? This is an ad for semen sample collection for male students that is posted right outside of our president's office in the campus. And when this first went up, I'm like, I know I found my home. So on that note, here's my next career goal, as I'm tired, my grandson.
Any questions? Just a little time? Okay.
So Germaine's been a colleague, friend for many years, but I have to say it really was you, Germaine. There was nothing, and you sought out people like Phil and Art, Lowell Seaver, Ron Viet, Ken Crickard. You really developed this area yourself, and I think we all should be very proud of what Germaine was able to do in largely a cancer-focused faculty. She worked very hard to make this happen, and you are, in my mind, the leading reproductive epidemiologist in the country, if not the world.
I'm in good company.
Yeah, congratulations, though, Germaine.
Amy Millen will introduce Shauna.
My name is Amy Millen, and I'm the Associate Chair of the department. Yesterday, we had the great pleasure of learning about the history of where we've come from. Thank you, Dr. Vina. And this morning, or I should say this afternoon, I have the enjoyable task of introducing some of our future. So Dr. Shauna Zorich, who will be speaking next, received her MD and MPH from the University at Buffalo. She is a public health practitioner with 5 years active duty in the military. After being here at UB, Dr. Zorich became a major in the U.S. Air Force, where she served as the influenza program lead and preventive medicine consult in the U.S. Air Force School of Aerospace Medicine at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base from 2013 to 2015. There she managed the influenza and respiratory surveillance program, and as such, she is an infectious epidemiology expert. We're also very happy to have her as faculty in our department, a clinical research professor. She is teaches one of our many undergraduate public health classes in our undergraduate public health program, which is growing exponentially. And so today it's my honor to introduce her, where she will give us a wonderful talk on influenza, past and present, a century of epidemics.
Well, thank you, Amy, for that introduction. I really appreciate it. And thank you, Joe, for inviting me to speak today. It really is a pleasure to be here. And thank you to all of you out in the audience for sticking around for the afternoon lectures. It's nice to have some friendly faces out there. So I did spend 2 periods of my life in the department, first in 2007 and 2008 as a preventive medicine resident. So I completed my residency with the department when it was SPM. And now more recently, I have returned to the department as the department is EH now, so I've returned to EH and I am teaching for the undergraduate public health program and also do some teaching for the grad program as well. But in between that time, as Amy alluded to, I was an active duty member of the Air Force. So I was a preventive medicine consultant for the Air Force. I was stationed at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, which is located in Dayton, Ohio. And there was a number of public health issues that I got involved with when I was in the military, but by far the most impactful and, in my opinion, the most fun was my work with influenza. And so that's one of the reasons that Joe asked me to speak today, because we all know that the department is celebrating its 100th anniversary, but there's another really important public health event that was happening 100 years ago, and I think we all know what that is, the pandemic of 1918. So I'm sometimes struck by the fact that there's people inside public health, but of course also outside of public health, that are not aware of the enormity of this event that occurred just a century ago. And so what I'm going to share with you next is a short video. It's a 1.5 minute video that was put together by the CDC to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the 1918 influenza pandemic. And I do urge you to read the captions, please. So this really was the most severe pandemic in recent history. And when you hear some of the numbers that were associated with this event, they're really astronomical, really difficult to wrap your head around it. So the estimation is that about 1/3 of the entire global population was affected by this pandemic in 1918. And so we're talking about 500 million people that were affected. And then when we look at the number of deaths that occurred, also these numbers are astronomical. So the estimation is about 50 million people that died during this event. And when we look specifically at the United States, we see over 675,000 deaths just in the United States. So many more people were dying from the influenza pandemic than were dying from World War I. And in fact, soldiers were more likely to die of influenza than they were likely to die from battle. So this is really an important event in public health history, and I think that as practitioners of public health and preventive medicine and epidemiology, we need to be aware of this event and know it and understand it. So there were a number of challenges that were posed in 1918 that we don't have to deal with today. The first challenge was the fact that the public health and medical practitioners at the time did not know what they were dealing with. They didn't know that they were dealing with a virus. Many thought it was due to a bacterial agent. So at the time, influenza hadn't been isolated yet. It hadn't been identified, so they didn't know what the agent was. Another problem was that there was no vaccine available, so we couldn't prevent the disease using pharmaceutical methods like vaccination. And then, of course, there weren't antivirals available, and there weren't antibiotics available to treat those individuals who had secondary bacterial infections on top of the viral infection that they had. And a lot of people ended up dying of those secondary bacterial infections. Another main problem during this time was the lack of medical personnel. So this was when World War I was going on. So you had physicians, you had nurses, you had medical personnel who were going overseas. They were deployed in the war effort. And so they didn't have medical personnel at home to deal with the even bigger problem that we were having right here in our very own country. And then finally, one of the major problems with this pandemic was the virulence of the strain of influenza. So this is referring to its severity. So it was very severe. We saw really high mortality rates, much higher than we would typically see for our regular influenza epidemics that occur every year. So very, very high rates of death during this particular pandemic. But despite all these challenges, of course, public health is not going to sit back and do nothing. Instead, we had to turn to non-pharmaceutical interventions. So this was things like closing schools and churches, banning any type of public gathering, using isolation of cases, using quarantining of contacts. In some jurisdictions, they even mandated individuals to wear masks. So in this picture here, we have police officers from Seattle, Washington, who are wearing masks because they were mandated to do so. And so these were some of the methods that were put into place to help deal with this at the time. And then I just have a few more pictures to share with you. So the Red Cross was highly relied upon during this time. So this is a picture of Red Cross volunteers that are making gauze masks in Boston. And then a number of cities took on educational campaigns. So this is an example of a streetcar sign in Cincinnati advising people to make sure that they're ventilating their homes. And then some municipalities even went to the extent of moving certain things outdoors. So, for example, moving court sessions outdoors so they didn't have to have people crowded into indoor spaces. So this is a picture of this occurring in San Francisco, California. And then, of course, there was a whole slew of less than scientific remedies that were being touted at the time. So eating more onions, eating more candy, drinking grapefruit juice. So, of course, these are not, scientific methods, but I'm sure the onion farmers found it very lucrative. So that's one plus from the pandemic. So what I wanted to talk a little bit about next is specifically what occurred in Buffalo and the response in Buffalo. And it's really great because in this particular magazine here, the Buffalo Physician, in 1990, an article was written about the pandemic in Buffalo and the response in Buffalo. And so here in this image, we see physicians that are working to help combat the pandemic in Buffalo. And one really neat thing about this article is the fact that they actually quoted Lloyd Graham, who's the father of UB Professor Saxon Graham, at the age of 96, saying, "I'm 96 years old and I never went through a period where an epidemic scared people like it did then. A lot of people died and doctors didn't have anything to effect a cure. Hospitals were jammed full and doctors were run ragged. It was worse than the war news at the time." And so I think Lloyd Graham sums it up really well in that particular quote. So flu first appeared in Buffalo in September. And so Buffalo had a little bit of an advantage because some other cities had already been hit, so they had a little bit of an idea about what was coming. But once it hit, it really hit fast. And then the pandemic peaked on October 20th, and on that day in Erie County, 138 people died in a single day. So that's when the pandemic peaked. And by the end of the pandemic, which in Buffalo lasted about 6-7 weeks, there was 28,000 deaths, or excuse me, 28,000 cases and over 2,800 deaths. So, as Dr. Vina shared with us yesterday, Buffalo was really on the forefront of public health during this time, and I think that their response to the pandemic is a really good illustration of this. So the acting health commissioner at the time, Franklin Graham, he formed a special advisory committee, and it included some prominent UB graduates, including Dr. DeWitt Sherman, who many of us are very intimately familiar with the building that is named after him, and then also Dr. Walter Goodale, a UB grad and also the future chair of our department. So a really nice connection, a really fantastic connection that I found out by reading this article. So like other cities, Buffalo relied on non-pharmaceutical interventions because of course they didn't have vaccines, they didn't have antivirals. And one thing that they did in Buffalo is they restricted the public assembly of any more than 10 people. So really everything was closed. Schools were closed, churches were closed, dance halls were closed, saloons were closed. Everything was closed. UB was closed for about 3 weeks, and even the football games were canceled. So you know that is a big deal when the football games were canceled. Another thing they did in Buffalo is they relied on their medical students. I mentioned earlier that many of the medical personnel were overseas fighting the war, and so there wasn't enough medical personnel to go around, and so they relied on medical students from sophomores up to help care for the overabundance of patients that they had. So these are some of the things that Buffalo did to help fight this pandemic, and they really fared well, or fared better than many other cities due to making sure that these regulations were kept in place. Of course, there was pushback from business owners and the business community, but public health stood strong and they kept these restrictions in place, and this really helped Buffalo deal with the pandemic. So since the pandemic of 1918, we've continued to see additional pandemics. They occur randomly. We don't know when they're going to occur. We just know that we're going to continue to see them in the future. And I don't have the time to talk about all of the pandemics that have occurred in great detail, but I did want to mention the 3 that have occurred since 1918. So in both 1957 and 1968, we had new strains of influenza that emerged from East Asia and then very quickly spread around the globe. The morbidity and mortality was much lower than what we saw for the 1918 pandemic, with about 1 million deaths globally, and then specifically looking in the United States, about 100,000. We do have to keep in mind that by this time we had a much better understanding of influenza, we had a better understanding of the agent itself, what caused the illness, and we also had vaccines in place by this time as well. And then of course we also have the pandemic that occurred in 2009, which all of us are pretty familiar with because this happened only a decade ago and we all lived through it. Thankfully, this strain of influenza did not cause anywhere near the amount of death that we were used to seeing in previous pandemics, but the morbidity was just astounding. So when we look at the number of cases, just in the United States, over 60 million cases of influenza due to the pandemic in 2009. So just some of these numbers I find them hard to wrap my head around because they're so big. So influenza is something that is always a threat. We see influenza come every year. It's going to hit every fall and winter. We have to get vaccinated every year. And another threat is the constant threat of a potential pandemic. It's not if it's going to occur, it's when it's going to occur. So these are always constant threats. But one thing that I wanted to draw your attention to is the threat of avian influenza. I think this is something that we need to be especially vigilant about. So H5N1 is a type of avian influenza. Avian influenza are strains of influenza that normally infect birds. It is rare but possible for humans to become infected with H5N1. So we started seeing some cases in 2003, and it is a very rare event. So we've only had about 860 human cases since cases started being identified. So this doesn't happen very often, but it is possible for H5N1 to cross the species barrier from birds to humans. Now, one thing that at this point is very fortunate is that H5N1 does not easily transmit from one person to another person. So once you have an individual that is sick with H5N1, they're not going to be transmitting to other people. But influenza is a really smart, tricky little virus, and it changes. And something that we have to be worried about is, could influenza, H5N1, mutate so that it's easier to cross the species barrier from bird to human? Make it easier for it to jump from one human to the next human. If these mutations occurred, then what we would have is we would have the mother of all pandemics on our hand, because we would have a situation where nobody is immune to the disease. There's no immunity whatsoever because only 860 people have ever been infected with H5N1. And it's brand new, so there's no immunity. And the other thing is it's extremely severe. So about 60% of people die from H5N1. So that's worse than Ebola. So I think we need to be more scared of this than we need to be of Ebola. So this is where I worked for 5 years for the Air Force, the U.S. Air Force School of Aerospace Medicine. And ironically enough, the history of this also dates back to 1918. So probably not coincidental, given the timing of the pandemic. But this is the Air Force's Institution for Research, Education, and Consultation in Aerospace Medicine. And very much like a university, it's department-based, and so I worked in the Department of Public Health and Preventive Medicine. And we had 3 different branches. We had an education branch, which taught public health officers and technicians, which were going to be going out to public health bases across the world and practicing public health at those bases. We also had an epidemiology laboratory, and then we had a consultation branch, which did really much more than consultation, but we were called the Epidemiology Consult Service. We were kind of like the little CDC of the Air Force. So that was the group that I was a part of, and within the Epidemiology Consult Service, there's a number of other groups, and one of those groups is the flu team. And so this is a few of the members of the flu team that worked with me on this particular program. So it's called the DoD Lab-Based Influenza Surveillance Program, kind of a mouthful, but basically it's a Sentinel-based program with Sentinel sites across the globe, dozens of Sentinel sites both in the United States and outside of the United States, so really have a global reach here. And what the program did is it set up all the Sentinel sites with collection kits, and when individuals would present to these military clinics, and if they met our influenza-like illness case definition, a specimen could be taken. We requested between 6 and 10 specimens a week. And then the specimens would be packaged up and shipped to the epidemiology laboratory, where they would be processed and they would be tested for a variety of different viral respiratory agents, including, of course, influenza. And also with the kits that we provided to the Sentinel sites, there was a questionnaire that was included as well, so we could get some demographic data, some travel data, some medical data like signs and symptoms, that kind of information. And then all of this data was managed and analyzed by flu team epidemiologists. I was very lucky to have usually between 3 and 4 epidemiologists that were managing this data. And then a surveillance report was produced every week, and it was distributed broadly across the DoD and in also civilian public health entities. So that's kind of the nuts and the bolts of the program, but what I wanted to mention here is the reason why I love working in the influenza program was because of how the program fits into the big picture of influenza prevention. So all of the data that we generated out of our program got shared with the Centers for Disease Control. So of course the Centers for Disease Control has their own very robust influenza surveillance system. But all this data is put together and then is utilized by the CDC and the FDA to inform them on their decision making for the following season's flu vaccine. So every year this advisory group comes together and has to make the decision, well, what strains are we going to include in the vaccine? And this data that our program generated was used to help make that decision. And so when you think about the number of doses of vaccine that are distributed every year across the United States, we're talking between 140 and 160 million doses of vaccine. I feel like you can't get much more public health than that. And so that's why I love being a part of this program. So I loved it, but this little guy came along, and I included this picture because you have to notice he has a UB alum baby t-shirt on. Yes, they do make those. Actually, UB just sent me one. Oh, it's great. So he came along, wasn't really expecting him, and it got a little bit harder to be out of the Buffalo area where all our family is. So I did decide to leave active duty. I transferred to the reserves, and I came back to Buffalo. But one really neat thing is I was able to leave the EH legacy behind because some of you may recognize this face. This is RJ Coleman. He's a recent EH graduate. I was able to help him get an ORISE epidemiology fellowship with the current influenza team. And he did his fellowship, and then he was actually hired to work as one of the epidemiologists on the team as a contractor. So he's now a flu team epidemiologist, and so I still kind of have my connection there, which is really awesome. So now I'm back at UB in EH, and I'm really excited to be a part of a new program. So the School of Public Health has started an undergraduate program. And so I was hired to teach in that program, so I'm going to be teaching a number of undergrad courses, but also grad courses as well. And it's an exciting time to be part of this program because it's growing by leaps and bounds. There's so much interest in public health. And when you can be a part of it at this stage, and these students are undergrad students, they come in not really knowing what public health is, and then I get to share that with them. And that's really neat when you get to be the person to teach someone what public health is and what it can do and how awesome it is. So these are two other ladies that are working with me in the undergrad program, and then here are a number of our students. This was us at the ice cream social. So keep doing the ice cream social. And so then I just wanted to say that I recognize that SPM/EEH really has played a major role in my career development. Joe taught me 501, Jean taught me 502, and so that laid the foundation for the rest of my career. So I want to thank you both and anyone else in the department that played a role in that. And just my public service, public health announcement, don't forget to get your flu vaccine every year.
Questions?
Thanks, and I'm Andy Hyland, 1998. I think I graduated from it. So a technical question. The flu, so in Buffalo, it was like September when it hit. So isn't flu season usually well after that when it peaks? Like, could it have been a lot worse if the timing had been different? Maybe a different way to frame that question.
So there's difference between influenza epidemics and pandemics. So So epidemics occur every year. We don't exactly know when it's going to start and when it's going to peak and when it's going to end, but usually somewhere in October, we see it starting, peaking January, February, and then we kind of see it trail off in March, April. But a pandemic can happen at any time. So the thing is, you just have to be aware that there's two different types of events. So the epidemics we see every year. The pandemics are these random events that have occurred just very rarely over, in the past century, we've had 4 of them, but it can happen at any time. So with the 2009 pandemic, we just finished a flu season. The 2009 pandemic started in April. So we just finished the 08-09 season, and then and then a pandemic started. So the timing with pandemics, you don't know when they're gonna be.
So that was a great talk, thank you. I just wonder, what is preventing us from developing a vaccine that can cover all forms of flu? Why can't we? Why do we every year try to figure out what's coming next? Can't we have a global vaccine?
And I know that is something that is hopefully coming in the future. One thing that is really difficult about influenza is that it's a virus that mutates very quickly. So there's something called antigenic drift that occurs, and so all the time, consistently, influenza is going through something called antigenic drift. So these small molecular changes are occurring, and as those changes occur, it can evade the immune system. So it's very smart like that. It knows how to change itself just a little bit so it can evade the immune system. And so these strains are changing over time. And so as that happens, we have to then catch up with the vaccine constantly. So since it's always changing, we constantly have to know what is circulating among human populations so we can then make sure that the vaccine is matching what is circulating in human population. So that's one of the biggest challenges, is that it's not like measles, which isn't, it doesn't change, but influenza is constantly changing. And so trying to keep up with that change is very difficult. Another issue that we have is the length of time it takes us to produce vaccines too. So we're still making most of our vaccines in eggs, and that's kind of an antiquated technology that it just takes a long time when you're growing the virus in chicken eggs. But there is a hope for, at some point in the future, to identify an antigen that can be utilized for a universal flu vaccine, so we can just give it once and then have protection for the future.
That was a terrific talk. I have 2 questions. The first one is, if a influenza pandemic were to hit again, we know that obesity increases risk of fatality with influenza. And we also know that antibiotic resistance is getting an enormously alarming rate. So in relation to what Jeannie was asking as well, with this antigen drift, we have this complication going on that if it hits again, we may not be as robustly able to protect even greater fatality, and there has been estimates made that it could even hit 147 million and more in no time at all, because of the vast mutation, the swine mutation, the human mutation, rate, obesity, which is what, 70–80% of the US population, and this problem with antibiotic resistance. So, what's the answer?
I guess I'm just going to have to agree with you. I agree. I mean, this is a problem. The thing about pandemic strains, you don't know how severe they're going to be and how they're going to affect people and what age group they're going to affect the most. And so it can be difficult to plan for something like that when there's a lot of unknowns. Now, when it comes, so you mentioned antibacterial resistance. So flu is a virus, but we do see some antiviral resistance with influenza. but not as much as we see with the antibiotics, and that is something that the CDC is constantly testing for. So we know at the, as specimens start to come in, and we can test to see, okay, are the strains that are circulating now, are they resistant to Tamiflu, which is one of the most commonly used antivirals. So yeah, it is. It's a challenge, and that's why preparedness is really important.
Yeah, the viral issues with virome and microbiome and bacterial, that's still to be sorted out. My second question now was, if it's okay to ask one other, is in the 1918 influenza pandemic, it was called the Spanish flu, but many people think that's a misnomer because it was the military, we're military, not in 1918 of course, but what's the military's view on that? That it was really a lot of the military that may have ended up actually been the source in the human population because they were in trench warfare, and they were all through the fields of Europe. There was a lot of back and forth density going on in those countries. What's your feeling on that? Because they got hit before we did.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's referred to as Spanish influenza, not because it originated in Spain, but during World War I, Spain was neutral, and so it was actually reporting on influenza where other countries were not, because they didn't want people to know that they had troops dying left and right. And so it had to do with the media. So the stories were coming out of Spain, and so that's why it was dubbed the Spanish influenza. But absolutely, the military played a really big role in the spread of this. So in the United States, it was first identified in Army troops in Fort Riley in Kansas. And these troops then subsequently were sent, were deployed for the war effort, and so there was a lot of moving people that were incubating influenza and could potentially transmit. So absolutely, the military's movement during this time played a big role.
Incidentally, my mother-in-law was born in 1907, had the Spanish flu, so she decided to have a lot of oranges and survived. But my question to you, do you know the case fatality in the United States? How does it compare with the case fatality in developing countries that have a national health service, like Scandinavian countries, for example?
So are you talking about in
Currently?
Developing patients.
Now, at this time, does it?
At this time, yeah.
When you have a national health service,
Does it make any difference?
No, I don't know the answer to that question. I'm sorry. I don't know. I mean, so the mortality rate in the United States, it varies from year to year. It's usually pretty low, like 0.1%, but I don't know how that compares to other countries that have national healthcare systems. I'm sorry.
And then at SPM. I have known and worked with him for years at Roswell Park, where he, until recently, served as the Senior Vice President of Cancer Prevention and Population Sciences. His career has focused on chemo prevention and associations between diet and cancer. He is accomplished as a researcher with hundreds and hundreds of publications, but fun fact, you may not know that he is also an avid windsurfer. So, oh yeah. We've had many conversations about the wind in Aruba. I drive by Lake Erie twice a day on my way to work, and I often see windsurfers on the lake, and especially on really cold days, I don't windsurf, and I wonder, who are these people who are out there windsurfing? It's 50 degrees outside. And one day we opened the Buffalo News, my husband opened the paper, and there was this giant picture of a windsurfer, and they were talking about these dedicated people who go out even when it's 50 degrees, and it was a picture of Dr. Marshall. Wearing a suit, windsurfing on the lake. So he certainly incorporates physical activity into his ideas of prevention. But today he is here to talk to us about 100 years of cancer prevention and control in Buffalo, and I'm really looking forward to it.
Thank you, and I appreciate you who are still here. You're either saints, or you don't have a ride home, or you're related to me. So, cancer, I changed the title a little bit because Jo had called me and she said, I need a title, and I kept screwing around with it. And she said, I need it now, and so I gave her a title, and then I changed it. And it's truly wonderful to be here. I interviewed Jo when we were considering her as a postdoc, yes, I have been here since before many of you were born. I interviewed Gene Wachtowski as a student at Roswell Park a long time ago. So let's go, and I'll talk about some of my experiences and my thoughts. And like I said, this is sort of a history, but it's also sort of a memoir. This is the work of Robert Kaplan. He's at Stanford, and he's raised some important questions about our policy with respect to handling health and disease. And so I think you can see it. We have emphasized cures to the effect of diminishing our attention to promoting health. And this was published, Kaplan was, as I said, at Stanford, and this was published by Harvard University Press. I would recommend it highly. Lewis Thomas was director of Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center for several years, and he raised an important point. We have seen massive improvements in human health over the past 100 years, but we need to be careful not to attribute all of those to medicine or to doctors. This is not a scree against physicians, but it's important to recognize that, as Thomas said, it's the engineers and plumbers that have made the most difference. And if we want to make a big difference in the third world, that's where we have to make the difference. We have to keep aflatoxin out of foods, and we have to keep, as Thomas said, we have to keep our feces out of our drinking water. Okay, and Kaplan also raises the question. We'd say, well, people do much better with heart disease, but Kaplan points out that that mortality from heart disease was decreasing well before we had the modern cholesterol lowering and hypertension lowering drugs that we now enjoy. So let me take a brief historical. When I was asked to speak by Jo, I thought, well, let's focus on Buffalo. And so here down at the south end of Boston, New York, is the plaque that honors Dr. Flint's discovery. It's Fuller's Tavern. I worry a little bit. If this had happened this year, Fuller would probably be in court suing Dr. Flint for publicity or libel or something like that. So there he is. You've already seen him many times. I was able to get these out of the health department, the Erie County Health Department. We need to understand how profound has been the change in human health as a result of sanitation. So here's typhoid fever. That's the disease on which Dr. Flint focused. But it's not just that. Here we have it for diphtheria. When I worked for the Los Angeles County Health Department, we had a couple of cases of diphtheria, and we immunized the entire Watts Willowbrook area within about 3 days. We know how to handle conditions like this better. Tuberculosis, we'll come back to tuberculosis in just a second. Dysentery, which kills untold numbers of children, and syphilis. Now, syphilis is especially interesting because the real drop began in the late 1930s. And what had happened in the 1930s? The discovery of penicillin. And people were treated, people with primary and secondary syphilis were treated with penicillin, but also almost everybody was treated with penicillin for something. And Lewis Thomas suggests that it was actually an accident that, tertiary syphilis came down as fast as it did. And he points out, when he was a resident in medicine in the early 1940s, there were more cases of paresis, mental illness caused by tertiary syphilis, than there were by schizophrenia. It's unbelievable how much change there was. And he suspects it was because of penicillin. Here is, you already heard about the epidemic of influenza in that wonderful talk. These are national data, and the records in the Erie County Health Department point out that Buffalo did a good bit better than the rest of the country in terms of influenza death. As you know, there has been this change. You all have seen this slide probably 100,000 times. Early on, there was very little lung cancer, and then it took off. And I was in class in about 1985 or something, and I remember the professor Philip Cole saying, pretty soon, lung cancer among women is going to exceed breast cancer. And there it is. Okay, Buffalo vital statistics. I was able to find these data from the Erie County Health Department. So in 1910 and 1919, I pulled these numbers for comparison. 16% of children died within a year. By 1919, it had dropped to 110. Typhoid deaths dropped by about a third, and pulmonary tuberculosis, actually the incidence of pulmonary tuberculosis death went up, although the rate went down because of growth in the population. Now, on the other hand, I was able to find cancer deaths in Buffalo in 1919, and so cancer of the buccal cavity, well, this was most likely partly due to chewing tobacco. Stomach and liver cancer were the biggies, and female genital cancers. But what you will notice is that there was no lung cancer to note. There were two categories of unspecified cancer, this one and of other organs. But clearly, lung cancer was something that was not happening in Buffalo quite yet. Dr. Goodale has already been mentioned. Dr. Goodale died quite suddenly in 1942. And the president of the university spoke at his memorial service quite suddenly. I wouldn't be surprised, I couldn't find it, but I wouldn't be surprised if he was a smoker and he died of either lung cancer or he had a heart attack. Okay, medical students. Well, there were medical students in 1919, and they were fond of the kinds of things that students do. So here's Francis Croggy. I'm probably screwing up his name. He went by Frank, and it points out that he liked the nurses at Memorial Hospital. So that was 100 years ago. I don't know what Frank is doing now, probably less. Mrs. Louise Bemis, who was on her way toward becoming a lady doctor, imagine that. And then there was almost Dr. Leon Andrzejewski, and those of you who were worried about this, He denied any allegiance to the Bolshevik cause. This was in the yearbook. So the coalition, the schedule of classes in hygiene and prevention in 1919. Sanitary surveys, the students had to go out and do this survey of a region. There were lectures from the City of Buffalo Health Department. There were classes in military hygiene and tropical sanitation, and medical jurisprudence and medical ethics. That was taught by John Lord O'Brien. And those of you who know about the North Campus, O'Brien Hall, that's the John Lord O'Brien after which that building is named. So water filtration, students were taught statistics and vital statistics, and they learned about vaccination. They examined school children, learned how to disinfect the house. They had to go to a slaughterhouse and see how it was done. They were following the lead of Sinclair Lewis. The tuition hadn't changed, or I'm sorry, the curriculum hadn't changed a lot by 1940, although there were two interesting additions. One was that there was this increased focus on industrial health, and there was also this concern with social aspects of medicine. Now, I didn't see any specification of what that was in addition to sanitation, but there was this concern with something about the social environment and how it affected people's risk of disease. So I want to mention very briefly the partnership between UB and Roswell Park. This is the work of Thomas Dow. Dr. Dow was a surgeon. His work is mentioned prominently in the yearly reports of the School of Medicine, and he was based at Roswell Park. This is his work on methylcholanthrin and the formation of breast tumors. Tom is one of the giants of carcinogenesis research. He unfortunately died about 15 years ago. But this was a part of the partnership between Roswell Park and the university. I think neither would be what it is were it not for this partnership. I think there's been a good deal mentioned about Dr. Morton Levin and what he did. I don't think it's been pointed out that when Ernst Winder, he was this arrogant little Austrian, and he went around, he had this idea that he sold to Everett Graham, not Saxon Graham, Everett Graham. He sold it to him. He was at WashU, he was a medical student. And he arranged to go out to California, and he went around to VA hospitals, and he would go up to the hospital bed and say, "Hello, I'm Ernst Winder, I'm a medical student, do you smoke?" And as he was doing that, he would look at what the disease was that the patient had and write it down on a clipboard. And he did that, and he found that smokers were approximately 5 times as likely to be lung cancer patients as the other patients in the thoracic wards of the VA hospitals. Now, what I have heard is that this paper went to JAMA, and JAMA was going to turn it down because he had done things wrong. He knew the disease before he asked about the smoking. And they said, well, that's clearly, somehow he was confounded. But what happened was that Dr. Levin's paper came in at the same time. And Levin, in Levin's study, they had already asked about smoking before they knew what the patient had. It used to be that you would go to Roswell Park before they knew what you had. You had to have a referral from a doctor, but they didn't know. And so Levin's work came up with about the same result. And so JAMA said, well, what the hell? We'll publish them both. And that was the beginning of the end for the tobacco company, sort of. Let's see, I wanted to mention, oh yeah, the other follow-ups on this. Dr. Graham, in the early 1950s, went with Dr. Ron Vincent, who was at Roswell, went to Albany and knocked on doors of legislators and said, we've got to get warning labels on these packs of cigarettes because they're bad stuff. And he was one of the first to do it. The government was thinking about this, but he was one of the leaders. And of course, I think Mike Cummings' work has also played an immense role. Mike and Gary Giovino and Andy Highland. I've had lots of chances to work with Mike over the years. He's sort of like a cross between a mad dog and a freight train. With all due respect to mad dogs and freight trains. Mike ran anti-smoking clinics at Roswell Park for years and years and years. And no matter how many people came in, he was there running those things to help people. And my children, the godmother of two of my children, went to one of his clinics and graduated, quit smoking. After a year, to celebrate her abstinence from smoking, she bought a pack of cigarettes. She died of lung cancer. The day she found out she had stage 4 lung cancer, she quit smoking again. But Mike ran that clinic. We also, at one point, decided to put together a poster because we thought people should know what happens to smokers. So I interviewed one man, Robert Craig was his name, at the VA hospital, and he had just found out the day I interviewed him that he had stage 4 lung cancer. We had a guy who had been the principal at Bennett High School. There were all these people who had quit, and this gentleman that I interviewed said, well, I asked him what kind of cigarettes he smoked, and he said, Lucky's. I guess it wasn't so lucky. And so I was talking to Mike about it, and I said, geez, what if we get sued about this? And Mike said, what could be more wonderful than that we would be sued by a tobacco company for saying cigarettes cause cancer? We didn't happen, thank God. Dave Monroe, who was the New York director of the American Cancer Society, said to me one time that the Clean Indoor Air Acts in New York were largely a result of Mike's work. So he deserves credit for that. All right, I wanted to mention Archibald, in the middle of the page, there's this, oh shoot. There's this citation. Where did it go? Yeah, there it is. Okay, citation of Archibald Dean. He was the part-time chair, the Department of Medicine and Hygiene, or Preventive Medicine, or Preventive and Social Medicine, whatever it has been. Had a part-time chair for several years, and it was considered a real advance when it got to be full-time. But there's this reference to the paper by Archibald Dean and Bill Hensel. Milt Terrace was addressing, he was chair, and this emphasis on social medicine, on the environment that affects health. Milt wrote this paper on the drift hypothesis. There's been a lot of concern with how it is that in the poorer social classes, there's more mental illness, more schizophrenia. And it's been suggested that it's because some people who are not mentally as healthy drift downward. And other people say, no, it's because of the stress of life in the poorer social classes. Well, Milt was addressing this in the mid-1950s. And I also thought it was interesting that he was talking about social medicine. There's been this focus on social medicine at the university in social and preventive medicine for a long time. Just to note, this is a cover letter from the dean introducing an effort by Abe Lilienfeld to do a smoking history, early 1950s. You all know about Warren Winkelstein's work, which the successors to that's been analyzed, that's still being analyzed as a source of data. Okay, I want to shift. The Mental-Hensel test gave us a way of controlling for confounding. But then in the late 1970s, we got means of using multivariate logistic regression and hazard analysis and so on and so forth. And we, myself included, assumed that everything would be okay because we could control for everything but the kitchen sink. Well, that's true if you have all the relevant variables in your model, and if you have the correct functional form, and if you have all the relevant variables measured correctly. If you have all that, you will in the long run get the right answer. If you don't, it's not quite so clear. And I've spent my life looking at diet and cancer and the problems of assessing exposure and change and identifying confounding have been humbling, to say the least. A frequently expressed criticism of epidemiology is that it's only observation. And I hear this, I've heard this a lot in cancer centers. So what we have done is institute a large number of clinical trials. And Laura and I were talking about this. These trials, cholestyramine, which was actually a heart agent, prostate cancer prevention trial of finasteride, the prevention trial where we changed people's diet, the women's health trial where we changed almost everything, the women's healthy eating and living and the men's eating and living study. These are dietary interventions with people who had low-grade, low-volume cancer, the selenium and vitamin E chemoprevention trial, wheat-bran fiber trial. These were all interventions that were largely inspired by epidemiology. The results have been modest and, to me, disappointing. One example of this is this trial. We took some of the finasteride trial took people who were at very low risk of prostate cancer. So what we did was take a group of men who were at very high risk of aggressive prostate cancer. They already had low-grade, low-volume risk or disease, and we randomized them. They either got a nutritionist talking to them, working with them over the phone for a long time, or they got a copy of a book. We knew that if they got the booklet, they wouldn't do anything, because you can't really change your diet unless you're obsessive compulsive or you have a nurse or a nutritionist biting at your heels. So I wanted to mention this because clinical trials are great, but they're not easy and they're not cheap. John Pierce and I talked about getting this study started in 2006. We finished follow-up to this trial in 2017. It took us 11 years. The manuscript has still not come out. It's under review. We had well-defined endpoints. PSA went over 10 nanograms per ml. PSA doubling time went to less than 3 years, or there was progression of the Gleason grade on repeat biopsy. We know the event rates. We expected 20 to 40% as an event rate. We actually saw 45%, so power was more than adequate. And how much change did we see? Well, we increased fruit and vegetable intake. Fruit and vegetable intake, we had almost no effect on fat intake. Did we change prostate cancer? Not a bit. We had it's stunning how little effect we had. And there are possible sources of this null finding: too little change, too late change, wrong change, change makes no difference, or the intervention was too short. Now, it's probably pertinent to mention, there has been good epidemiologic evidence that aspirin protects against cancer, colon cancer especially. But if you look at cohort studies in which people have been taking aspirin for 5 years or less, you see nothing. They have to be taking this stuff for 10 years So when we do chemoprevention trials, if we're not watching people for a long time, and it's not going to be cheap, we're not going to see much. So we still need cancer prevention trials. We're going to need to identify better biomarkers. And we're probably going to have to watch people for a longer time. We need better agents. They're going to have to be better targeted. Standard for us is to say, okay, look, if I change this by a statistically significant amount, then that's good enough. No, it's not good enough. You think about the communicable disease studies. You had to wipe it out. If there was any exposure, that was too much. Okay, let me just close talking about genomics and epidemiology. We've got lots going on with genomics and epidemiology. A lot of variables there and a lot to work on. Now, this is a quote from Francis Collins, and we need to be careful because sometimes we get awfully optimistic. So Francis Collins in the year 2000, as they were announcing the completion of the human genome, says, over the long term, perhaps another 15 to 20 years, you will see a complete transformation of therapeutic medicine. That was in 2000. And in 20 years, it has not happened. Now, Kaplan describes this as a bust. We don't need to describe it as a bust, but it should humble us in the prospects, about our prospects for making a big difference. And we do hear this term of precision prevention. I'm A, not sure what it means, and I'm B, doubtful that it's going to be feasible in the near future. Okay, mentioning Kaplan, he said, let's not get too on fire for our biomedical moonshots. So far, in his opinion, they've had fairly modest effects. Okay, so the easy problems have been addressed. Our struggle, we can't stop, but we're going to need to do some more work. And the reason we're doing this is because we want the world in which Benjamin Arden Marshall Hilliker grows up to be a more healthy one. Thank you very much.
We'll let you be the last word, Enrique.
Oh, no. That's
Santa Claus.
Or Jim will be the last word.
Jim, very nice work. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about this idea. There is all the discussion of looking at trials, not as intent to treat, but analyze them by protocol, per protocol. And given that you're talking about trials that are likely to have lots of low compliance, like diet, something that people don't comply as well. Do you have any ideas if we could be, how can we change that? If the trial is the right approach to be thinking about low compliance intervention, and maybe that should be the new thinking, or have you made any attempts to look at the per protocol analysis of this?
Well, I'm not sure I understand the difference between per protocol and intent to treat. As far as I know, in intent to treat, you say, all right, here's what you were assigned to, here's what you were assigned to, let's look at the results according to that. And that I think is, that was certainly the trials.
So the biological effect will actually be if everybody, in a word that everybody would have taken the intervention as they were supposed to, complying 100%. So a trial is only causal in the sense that it will be perfect, perfect in every sense. So a trial that is not perfect is not much better in some ways than an observational study.
Okay, in the wheat bran fiber trial I worked on, in the polyp prevention trial, in the men's eating and living study, I know that we We squeezed the data every which way we could. There just wasn't much there. I think in the Women's Health Initiative, there's been a lot of work to sort out and find a signal. So far, the results have been pretty modest.